Morning. Can I welcome everyone to the 29th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019 and remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones. Apologies have been received from Kenneth Gibson. Agenda item 1 is consideration of whether to take agenda items 4 and 5 and 6 in private. Item 4 is consideration of evidence heard today on pre-budget scrutiny. Item 5 is consideration of evidence heard today on building regulations and fire safety. And agenda item 6 is consideration of proposed witnesses for the period products bill. Are we all agreed? Thank you. That is agreed. Agenda item 2 is an evidence session on pre-budget scrutiny. We wrote to the Scottish Government at the end of last month with our views in relation to next year's budget, touched on various issues including the effect of single-year budget settlements and council decision-making, providing for certainty in the house building budget post-2021, funding for preventive spend, including housing adaptations, climate change targets in local government, and wider fiscal reform and empowerment in local government. The committee agreed that it would be helpful to discuss these and other issues with the Scottish Government ahead of receiving its formal response. So today I welcome Aileen Campbell, Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, and Kate Forbes, Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Committee, and thanks for inviting us today to give evidence as part of your pre-budget scrutiny. And as you said, I'm joined today by Kate Forbes, Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy, and also supported by Shirley Lane, Brad Gilbert and Graham Owenson. And we very much welcome the Committee's budgetary scrutiny and appreciate the work that you've done to date to enable a clear picture of the priorities that you as a committee have. We face significant challenges as we prepare for this budget, demographic challenges, fiscal challenges as a result of continued austerity and welfare reforms, and also political uncertainty caused by Brexit. And in meeting these challenges, it is crucial that we work in partnership with local government and the wider public sector in precisely the way Christie challenged us to do back in his report back in 2011. That partnership approach and a desire and a need to focus on outcomes has led to the creation of the National Performance Framework and a focus on wellbeing, inclusive growth, tackling poverty and reducing inequality. And partnership with local government has brought real rewards. We are on target to deliver 50,000 affordable homes this Parliament. We're working in partnership to end period poverty, collaborating to end homelessness, and together we're expanding and improving early learning and childcare, developing a flexible, high-quality provision that will support children and their families. But while that is good and transformative, challenges remain, and we know that we need to do more. The Local Governance Review provides us with the opportunity to reshape democracy, strengthen community decision-making and reimagine where power lies. And our work on housing up to 2040 enables us to think beyond parliamentary cycles and create a new housing system for Scotland for the longer term. So I hope that beyond this budget scrutiny that the committee will engage on those bits of work, as these elements speak to both the reform and innovation that I think the committee is looking for us to take forward. So hopefully that sets out some of the key areas of work that we're taking forward in this portfolio, and look forward to the questions that the committee I know will have following the significant bits of work that you've taken forward from stakeholders. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And Minister, I believe you want to make a brief opening statement.
Very briefly, I thought it would be helpful to sketch out where we are with the budget process in particular and any other financial elements, and thanks to the committee for having us today. As you'll know, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work wrote to the Finance and Constitution Committee on the 6th of November advising that the Scottish Budget could no longer be held on the 12th of December due to the general election, which will be no surprise to any members here. And without, of course, the UK Government's tax announcements and the Office for Budget Responsibilities, Tax, Social Security and Economic Forecasts of a UK budget, we don't have the clarity on the funding that will be available for public services in Scotland. And alongside that lack of clarity, exiting the EU and particularly the threat of a disorderly Brexit, these are some of the most economically disruptive challenges that are currently facing the country, and certainly that the Scottish Government's had to face in 20 years of devolution. When the UK Government does deliver the 2021 budget, decisions on how to allocate the resources available to Scotland will be a collective Cabinet decision as part of the spending review process. But of course, course, we are already engaging with COSLA and with other parties to ensure that we keep this, give as much advance notice as possible throughout this. The spending review framework, which was published in the medium-term financial strategy, set out our approach for resource and for capital and focuses on outcomes and well-being in line with the national performance framework, and we're determined to ensure that we use our fiscal levers to the best possible use for the public services in Scotland.
Thank you very much. Can I ask then, the Scottish Government, could you provide concrete information on how it will manage the multi-year financial settlements for local government and respond to concerns that have been raised around the decoupling of revenue and capital budgets?
That's probably one for me that I'm happy to pick up on. So we have previously given a commitment to bring forward a 3-year funding settlement for local government from 2020-21. And I think the committee outlined quite succinctly the reasons why that's to the advantage of local authorities in the letter to Aileen Campbell. However, you'll appreciate that with the UK government's position right now in terms of the announcement of the general election and our budget, we are considering our approach to this year's budget, but the level of uncertainty that our entire budget is being subjected to makes it extremely difficult to plan for next year, let alone for the next 3 years. It's not a situation of our making, it's not a situation that we want, but we're liaising on budget timing and also on the planning, and we continue to have discussions with COSLA, but it does make it very difficult to plan beyond the next year. In terms of decoupling the revenue and the capital settlement, so we will not decouple the revenue from capital budgets next year, but we'll set out very clearly what our spending plans are for both resource and for capital. So I already mentioned the spending review framework, which was in the medium-term financial strategy, and that sets out the approach for resource and for capital multi-year reviews of spending. And following a recommendation from the Budget Process Review Group, and as agreed with the Finance and Constitution Committee, there's a presumption that the Scottish Government will carry out a spending review linked to the equivalent UK spending review in an effort to give as much advance notice as possible of our budget going beyond next year. Really briefly in terms of capital, although you may want to come back to that in another question, the capital budgets beyond 2020-21, so beyond next year's budget, will take account of the Infrastructure Commission's findings at the end of December 2019. And as committee members will know, the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland provides that long-term strategic advice on national infrastructure priorities, and those recommendations will be critical to our next infrastructure investment plan.
Thank you. Just further to that, in terms of the multi-year financial settlements, I accept the problems that arise this year, but is a commitment to still be looking at doing that when the situation settles down?
There's certainly still a commitment, which, as part of discussions and negotiations with COSLA, that we will try and give as much in the way of multi-year funding as possible going forward. It's just very difficult to make that commitment next year in light of the uncertainty that revolves around one-year budget, let alone 3-year budgets.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Cam.
Thanks, Convener. Minister, you mentioned you'd been in discussions with COSLA. Of course, one of their frustrations frequently expressed to this committee is around the level of commitments, government spending commitments that they are mandated to carry through, leaving them with very little wriggle room over the rest of their budgets. So have there been any discussions with COSLA around that and about fully funding the government commitments going forward?
Well, I think I'll take that in two levels. One is you're essentially referring to ring fencing, and in terms of ring fencing, when the SNP came into government in 2007, one of the first steps that we took was to significantly reduce ring fencing. So in 2007, just to give you some context, the ring fence grant accounted for 2.7 billion. Now it is just under 900 million. So that's less than 8% of the total funding. So in terms of giving local authorities as much freedom as possible to use their funding as they see fit. That is a core element of the local government financing process. In terms of fully funding commitments, these commitments are firstly part of local authorities' core services. So in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, they are part of their core purpose. And secondly, there is a lot of negotiation and discussion that goes on around any of these commitments, as you'll have seen very clearly with the early learning and childcare, for example, where local authorities were very clear in terms of what they needed, and Scottish Government was very open in saying we'll ensure that those funding commitments are met.
So have you had these discussions with COSLA recently?
We speak to COSLA regularly, and I would say almost in every conversation, discussions around funding come up, and that will include discussions around Scottish Government commitments that local authorities are delivering. But we're partnering with them to deliver.
Okay.
Andy?
On that, Minister, so in last year's budget deal, the Scottish Green Party and the Scottish Government reached an agreement, including, and I quote, "We will work jointly with COSLA to agree a 3-year funding settlement for local government, along with a supporting rules-based framework." Now, I take your point about one-year budgets and stuff and put that to one side, but there was no anticipation then that capital and revenue would be decoupled. So, as far as I can see it, if they have been decoupled or intend to be decoupled beyond year one, that's a breach of that agreement.
Yeah, I think I said quite clearly in my answer that we have no intention of decoupling.
My understanding is there's no intention to decouple in year one, but there is an intention to decouple in year 2 and beyond.
Well, I mean, I'm not trying to hide anything with my words. I was just quite simply stating that certainly this year we will not decouple, and there's no plans that are live right now.
But the evidence we have is that from beyond year 1 there will be a decoupling, and this is something to do with some recommendations from the Scottish Infrastructure Commission.
Well, at the moment, I mean, we will not. Our plan is not to decouple. I think what I was trying to say in my answer was that going forward, we fully intend to take account of the Infrastructure Commission, but we're going to be very clear in stating what capital budgets are and what revenue budgets are over the longer term, which is what COSLA would like us to do, to provide as much advance notice as possible of what capital and revenue budgets might look like. But I'm not suggesting here that we're going to decouple beyond next year. I'm simply saying we've got no intentions of decoupling this year, and going forward, in light of the request around multi-year funding, one of the ways which will enable us to give as much long-term multi-year information as possible will be the Infrastructure Commission's findings, on which will inform our decisions around capital going forward.
Okay, thank you. One of the issues that came up quite a lot when we were looking at sick leave and absence rates was the disparities between local councils. What work is the Scottish Government undertaking with councils to promote best practice around managing these issues?
I noted the evidence that you took. Certainly, we always stand ready to provide any support that local government would need. However, local authorities are autonomous bodies that are responsible for managing their own day-to-day business, including employment matters such as staff absenteeism. But there is work, as we know, underway through COSLA. There is work and support, I think, on offer from the Improvement Service. So there's a range of things that if government would be helpful in terms of being involved, and we would stand ready to support that work in terms of, I think, what they might be looking at and developing new policies to cope with some of that, different employment practices, trying to support staff in a much more empathetic and holistic way as well. So we stand ready. However, local authorities are autonomous in their own right and in charge of their own day-to-day management of their staff. But as again, you would reiterate any support that Scottish Government can provide, any kind of national guidance that can be supportive of that work, then we would stand ready to help them in any way. So,
taking the autonomy of local authorities is read, but we have got what the committee was told particularly good examples about the way that Glasgow's changed things around. How, given the impact that this has on the country as a whole, the level of sickness and absence, What role can the Scottish Government have in making sure that the good practices that are being fulfilled in, say, cities like Glasgow are carried out, or are at least put in front of the local authorities to try and take advantage of?
Well, you know, again, if working with COSLA, if there is a need for Scottish Government to take a role in this, then we could take that national leadership role. We could help support and share good practice. We could support the development of policies. I think and understand that the Improvement Service and Solace are also involved in this engagement more generally. So, yeah, whatever local authorities would like us to do, whatever COSLA would like us to do to be involved in that, which is a really important issue, then we would happily take up that offer, help support that national sharing of good practice. If there was other ways which we could provide other support, there's probably a number of different things that we could do. Again, though, protecting the fact that local authorities are responsible for the day-to-day management of their own staff. But if there is a desire for us to be involved, then I'm sure we would help. And of course we would help and use any levers that we had to provide that support, that sharing good practice, showcasing good practice, all of those things that would be enabling local authorities to perhaps change the culture or provide different ways to provide support to enable staff to feel supported and for us to look critically at how we reduce that absenteeism.
Okay, thank you for that. And can I now officially welcome the officials, Graham Monson, Shirley Lang and Brad Gilbert, to the committee.
Very well done.
On that?
Yeah, on that issue, just check if I've heard you correctly there, Cabinet Secretary. Was that an actual offer to help councils reduce the level of absenteeism? Because there's been a real frustration actually on this committee for some time that we've got these wide disparities in absenteeism across councils, and of course the worst ones, that comes at quite a cost. You know, if you've got a large number of people off over the course of a year, there's a big cost to that. So getting the numbers down is a benefit to everyone. So was that an actual offer to do something?
Yeah, absolutely. We are always happy to work with COSLA and local authorities to, again, as I said to Mr Dornan, share good practice. If there is good examples of a local authority performing well, supporting their staff, reducing that absenteeism, enabling people to kind of come back to work, feel supported in that progression back to work, then yeah, if there is a desire for us to be involved, we will happily be involved in that, because ultimately, I suppose, this is about delivering good services to the communities that we both represent, and part of that will require staffing to be supported to enable that delivery of those services. So it's in our interest, all of our interests, to make sure that work can continue. And I think that offer is there if the local authorities, COSLA, want to take that up. Happy to engage and work out where that role might be and what is the best way to do that, with also bearing in mind that local authorities are autonomous and in charge of their own day-to-day management of their HR and their own personnel. But if they want us to be involved, we would happily be involved, because I think, again, if we want to focus in on outcomes and support people who need and require support to be back into work, because it has a number of different outcomes that are applicable to child poverty, making sure we tackle in-work poverty, all those things that are related. It's in all of our interest to make sure that we can support people back into their employment.
Local government committee, we are not trying to take away the autonomy of any local government.
But there are related issues around child poverty rates, in-work poverty, all these things that can disrupt family life, being absent from work, statutory sick pay, all of those things that have knock-on impacts across that wider sense of well-being for that individual and their family. So, yeah, like I say, it is in all of our interest, and I am, I don't know how much more clear I can be. If local authorities want us to be involved in that work, we would stand ready to be involved in that work because of the other related policy issues that are impacted on by employment.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. My last question is about housing organisations are looking to maintain the rolling development plans beyond 2021. Do you think there's scope for a cross-party statement of intent to ensure this happens, and would the government be willing to play their part in that?
Well, I mentioned in my opening remarks about that we're looking to have a broader conversation around what is the housing system to be like up to 2040. There's ongoing consultation events happening across the country at the moment, and we've engaged thoroughly with different stakeholders to date on that. There is the ambition as well to deliver the 50,000 affordable homes up to 2021. So, the natural question is then what next? So, Kate Forbes outlined some of the budgetary challenges that we face in terms of having the understanding, the clarity from the UK government before we can set our own budget. So, some of this will be wrapped up in those discussions. And because there is housing as a really important part of Scotland's infrastructure, we need to make sure that all of those things are in place before we can, make any commitments. But I think what we understand is that housing and social housing is in critical importance. It impacts on the country's well-being, impacts on our attainment. If our children and young people have good houses that they feel safe and warm in, they can perform better at school. So it hits a number of different targets that are within our outcomes, within our national performance framework. So it's in all of government's interest to make sure that we do recognise the huge importance of housing beyond just that bricks and mortar, and enables us to deliver against the national performance framework. But the fact is that the budget situation at the moment doesn't give us that, we don't have that clarity yet to make a firm commitment. But I'm sure that the committee will make sure that your points and your concerns are articulated strongly in that about what you would like the government to do in our budget.
Thank you. Graham, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if the Cabinet Secretary picked up on the question, which was, is there scope for a cross-party statement of intent? And that's really looking ahead to the next Scottish elections. And I think it's something that the housing sector would be seeking is
absolutely, and we get asked these things quite regularly. I'm just talking through the challenges that we have in terms of the budget. But what I'm also saying, and given the committee, is my thoughts around the wider importance of housing beyond just the delivery of new housing. So we have to think about it in the round as well. So it's not just about the delivery of new houses, it's also about making sure that we don't miss the need to improve existing stock as well. And if the people want to work on a cross-party basis on housing, then again, the housing up to 2040 is a perfect vehicle for us to think collectively about what that new system might be and how we embed the changes that we need to see happening.
Well, I would have thought, as my party's housing spokesman, there certainly is an opportunity for all parties to get round the table ahead of those elections and see where we can agree.
Absolutely, and that is partly, the Labour Party have produced and published documents around their thoughts around housing. I happily engage with the other political parties. That's part of my ambition in this development of the new system, is to make sure that we kind of get out of the parliamentary cycles, which sees us kind of competing against each other, when fundamentally we probably all agree about the importance of housing. So how do we make good use of that collective ambition and enable us to have the stability that the housing sector also says they want us to have, and not just be limited to the 5-year electoral cycles, but think about how we plan and change a system up to 2040. So again, if you want to come and tell us your thoughts and views, I'll happily hear them and engage with you on the consultation and conversation we're having at the moment.
Another useful offer. Thank you.
Good.
There you go. Don't say you never get in out of this committee. Hey. Thanks very much. Andy, you've got a question?
Yes, before moving on to my question, I just want to follow up Graham Simpson's question there, because the question is fairly straightforward, that there's a commitment to affordable house building programme, but that commitment only lasts up to May 2021, and given the timescales involved in developing land and planning, and procurement, etc., the question was, are you willing to, in principle, agree with all other parties in this Parliament defined, continued commitment beyond 2021 on affordable house building, so that there can be some certainty and predictability out there for the affordable housing sector?
So the housing up to 2040 is designed...
No, I'm not talking about 2040.
But that's after 2021. So I'm setting the context by which we're looking to plan and work across political parties to develop a vision and ambition up to 2040. I'm happy to work with political parties beyond the 2021. What I'm also articulating, though, is the challenges, the significant challenges that we have in terms of our budget around giving some of that commitment just now, but that will be part of the budget process around
But
what we do immediately after
an
2020.
in-principle commitment to say, for the sake of argument, to deliver 50,000 affordable homes in the next Parliament, that wouldn't cause you a problem. A statement in principle. Obviously, all things can change, budgets can collapse.
I think that's premature. Like I'm saying, and I know that you wanted to dismiss that, but the fact is we've got an ongoing consultation at the moment with the housing sector in its widest possible sense to understand what is the housing requirements, what are people's views and thoughts, what do communities feel and want. So I wouldn't want to prejudge that by saying we would say 50,000. I think we all understand and agree that there is a need, a continued need beyond the 50,000 target at the moment, that we will continue to need to build and deliver social housing. I'm not going to prejudge the outcomes of the consultation that we're having on Housing Up to 2040. If that's your thoughts and views, then happily to agree and to meet with the Green Party as well to understand what are your thoughts on that as well.
I'm asking you now, it's a very straightforward question. It's just about an affordable house building programme.
I don't really see how we can ask for a cross-party statement of intent and have the government say that what we're going to do is this. Because then what is the point of having discussions with your party, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, if the government have already said that after 2021 this is what they're going to be doing? The whole point is to have those discussions beforehand.
Moving on.
Now your question, Andy.
Yeah, yes, so I mean, my questions are in preventative spend, and I don't want to touch on IJBs at the moment because I think my colleague Graham Simpson will be touching that shortly. But we've heard quite a lot of evidence about the difficulties involved in making the kind of investments that are necessary to deliver genuine preventable spend programmes whereby we can reduce the demands on certain more acute public services by stepping in at an early stage to prevent those acute needs arising. And this poses a challenge, obviously, to local government because investment is required up front with a potential payback period of perhaps as long as 5 to 10 years. What thinking has the government been doing on how to embed a programme of preventative spending, which I think all parties agree with and has been widely agreed since the Christie Commission, in order to make sure that local government can properly plan services for the medium and long term in a way that reduces the demand on the more acute services by avoiding the need for people entering whether it's the justice system or the health service or homelessness.
Mm-hmm. So there is already a prioritisation of prevention, and that's also part of the National Performance Framework as well, and as you say, rooted as well to the recommendations from Christie. So we can point to a number of different areas of policy where prevention is fundamentally underpinning the policy decisions that we take. So we can point to and look at child poverty as a good example, where there's significant investment going to address child poverty because of the preventative role that will have for future outcomes for those individual children and society more generally. We can point to things like family nurse partners. We can point to the £1.4 billion support to low-income households, 100 million to mitigate some of the worst impacts of the UK government welfare cuts. So all of those things are preventing that further dent to well-being for those families. And that's happening from ourselves in terms of the investment we make as a government, but also through the good work that local authorities are taking forward to support families. And we've had the local government, their own reports about what they're doing on child poverty as well, to illustrate the more kind of local policy developments that are happening at that level as well.
So can I ask you specifically though, on the accounting for this? Because if, for example, a local authority spends let's say £100, a fictional amount, £100 on an initiative around housing or health or something like that, and that saves the NHS, saves the police a sum, either less than that or indeed more than that. How can we build an accounting framework such that local government is incentivised to undertake preventative spending when the savings and the benefits will accrue to budgets held by other public sector organisations? It doesn't seem to me yet that we've managed to create a sort of funding and accountability framework that makes that straightforward.
So I think Kate will want to come in. However, I will say that also in my discussions that I have with a number of different local authorities, public services, even as far back when I was the Minister for Children and Young People, that oftentimes the galvanising thing has been the outcomes. And the other thing that I think Christie kind of challenged as well was to how do we kind of take away some of the silos of where public financing sits and actually use the collective resource to maximise the service delivery and the impact of that funding as well, regardless of where those pockets of money sit across public life. So in my experience, I think, from what local governments, community planning partners, that there has been, and there will be, frustration as well about some of what you describe. But in essence, I think what good planning has enabled is for the focus to be on the outcomes and to deliver on the needs and the aspirations of the community, regardless of where that gets then accounted for.
Just briefly to add, I take your point, because I think it's challenging when it comes to the actual core accounting. Beyond sharing budgets and active collaboration, it's difficult. Now, obviously, local authorities, like every other public body, have as much freedom and flexibility as possible to use their budgets as they see fit. But I know you don't want to come on to IJBs, but I think it's an interesting example of where actually, short of sharing budgets, it's very difficult to recycle savings between different organisations. Now, every government agency, government department, as well as local authorities and other public bodies, have the freedom and the flexibility to work collaboratively when trying to resolve particular challenges. And I think when you see, even was it last year when we were hitting the news for something like violence reduction in Scotland, and again, what was referred to is the fact that there was unlikely alliances between education, justice, and others to try and deal with a core problem. So I see it too, coming at it from a slightly different perspective, from a digital perspective. You're talking about prevention, and when it comes to investing in significant capital projects, which we know will drive, a freedom and an efficiency, and we work collaboratively with local authorities to try and support them to invest in, for example, improved digital services so that they can drive better outcomes. But that's an active decision to collaborate and work together. It doesn't come about just naturally by itself without that determination to collaborate. And short of forcing people to share budgets, it is just about the collaboration.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just come in very briefly on that one then? Is there not, I suppose to some extent this is a sort of academic exercise in terms of when you're organising budgets, if the actions of one sector is benefiting the other sector, is there not some way that you can marry that up to so that the next budget, for example, it might well be that the sector who did the work gets the reward from the sector who benefited from it? Very theoretical, but that's something that we've been looking at. We've had organisations in front of us complaining might be too strong, but talking about the fact that they'll do this, the benefit is elsewhere, but it's still coming out their budget. So is there any way, it's not an easy job, I don't expect you to come back in 2 weeks with a letter telling us you've done it, but is there any way that the government could be looking at doing something like that?
The other thing is to say that we look at these things at a cabinet level, and Aileen might be able to speak more knowledgeably about that, but in terms of bringing the budget together as a whole, that is a collective cabinet decision, and that means that when spend is being discussed in one portfolio area, there's another discussion happening about how it's going to benefit or perhaps disrupt another area. So it is a collective decision-making process. And if that's happening at the top, as it were, the hope is that then organisations and agencies are working together to ensure that the savings are being recycled.
And I might just maybe point again, though, that not to that cabinet level kind of discussion, but to a practical example, for instance, like the Early Years Collaborative, where that brought together a range of professionals, third sector, whole host across NHS, education, the gambit of people who will have an involvement in a child's life at those early stages, bringing everyone together to agree a set of outcomes, stretch aims in terms of the improvement methodology that was used, to understand what do we focus in on and who's best placed to do that, and how do we kind of collaborate and complement what each other does. driven by the focus on that child's life, as opposed to where that child will fit in terms of service delivery. So what that ends up meaning then is that outcomes are improved regardless of whose budget has helped create that, but you've got a tangible improvement of where you've measured that child's life has had benefit because of the collaboration that's happening at that front end of delivery. That also empowers the frontline practitioners as well to challenge back up the tree, as well as there needing to be that national leadership about how we try and embed prevention in a much more routine, disciplined way, but actually on the ground where it was happening through the Early Years Collaborative, albeit that old money, it's now a different name for the Children and Young People's Collaborative. But from what I saw, that empowerment of frontline practitioners enabled much better decision-making to happen because they focused in on the individual needs of the child and the outcomes for that child, as opposed to getting het up about whose budget line did what. And actually, that might then end up being in 25 years' time, it might mean that child doesn't end up in Pullman, but that child might end up in university, as opposed to that's a longer-term point of view. But what's also important is that you protect that early investment and don't let it slip through adolescence. So that's why at all stages and ages of that child's life that there needs to be support, and that's what we endeavour to do through the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan Progress Report. We endeavour to show the life course and all the ranges of support that government, public life more generally, can offer up to support that child so that it enables them to go in to contribute to life when they emerge into their own adulthood.
That example and the violence reduction unit example are exactly the type of thing that I'm suggesting that we try and get to eventually, just in general, because that happens. You've got specific programmes there, and that works so well in there. It's just that in the general run-of-mill of things, it's much more difficult where some organisations are working.
And it is difficult, and some of this comes back also to some of the questions you had earlier about that kind of clarity in that sense, and I think that's aspiration that we all want to get to, where we can enable us to make, like Christy challenged us and the National Performance Framework demands that we do, is to make better use of the public resource, because when the public pay into this, they don't really have any ideas about that going into the police pot or the NHS pot or the council pot. They just want good services, and so we need to kind of make sure that we use that as our guiding principle when we deploy and marshal the money that's entrusted to us to spend.
Okay, thank you. Andy, do you want to ask the next question just now, and then I'll come on to you, Graham? I know, and then I'll come on to you, Graham.
Thank you.
And
Okay, so this is a question about, we've had a session with local government and other interested parties on the medium long-term financial state of local government, and there has been a fairly consistent call, obviously, for more certainty, but also for more autonomy. And I'm aware that the government has been convening with COSLA a local governance review. I'm also aware that there's no plans to introduce legislation this session, but nevertheless, those conversations have been ongoing, and I'm wondering if you can give the committee any insight into your deliberations, particularly in relation to providing greater fiscal autonomy for local government.
Yeah, I'll kind of give an overview of the local governance review, and then Kate Forbes leads on the fiscal element of that. So you're right, there has been ongoing discussion and engagement between ourselves and local government. We jointly oversee the progression of the local governance review work, and there has been the consultation events that happened around the country to gather in thoughts and views from communities as well about what they felt they would like to see with the opportunity of reimagining democracy in Scotland. So there is the fiscal element, there's the functional element, and then there's the community element, which is around how we can engage with our communities and build on community empowerment legislation. And that work's ongoing, and we're about to go out again to communities to try and paint more of a picture as to what might be possible. I think there was a desire that came back to us from communities for us to be able to kind of illustrate some of the models that might be more appropriate for communities, or for them to get a better understanding of what's possible for them to engage with this process. So the reason that we didn't want to legislate this time was because also there was a call for us to make sure that we don't lose this opportunity and to get it right and to take a bit more time over that. But that doesn't stop us kind of progressing some of the other areas of work that we need to do and making and testing some ideas in the short term. So we're currently working with local authorities on that work to go out again to communities to get a better understanding of the models that they would like to see tested and probed and worked through from their point of view, and Kate Forbes leads on the work around the fiscal empowerment of local authorities.
And that fiscal element is progressing as well. And I think from my perspective, it's quite important, whilst there's sort of three strands in terms of the fiscal and the other areas, it's quite important to keep sight of them all in the round. I suppose the fiscal element is focusing on two different areas. The first is that there's obviously a number of pieces of work that are progressing right now after last year's budget, which was the most significant empowerment of local authorities since devolution. So there's obviously the transient visitor levy, there's a workplace parking levy, and there's a devolution of empty property relief. So that is forming an element of discussion. And then secondly, it's what comes beyond that, and how does additional tax or revenue raising powers sit within COSLA or local authorities' wider financial settlement. So, I mean, those conversations with COSLA are progressing. Some of the focus has been on this year's activity, but still focusing in the future on how revenue raising sits within the wider funding settlement.
And what's the government's view as to how much fiscal autonomy local government should have?
Our view is that we've obviously taken steps this year in terms of these three areas that I mentioned. I think we want to ensure that local authorities have as much freedom and flexibility on spend as well as source of money. In terms of how local authorities come to their settlements right now, 42.9%, I think it is, of overall revenue in local authorities comes from either revenue raising like council tax or from fees that they place. So that's actually not a bad starting point, but we are supportive of additional conversations. If COSLA have particular recommendations on revenue raising powers that they would like to see, we are open to discussing those.
Of that 42%, fees and charges take up about, I think, 6 or 7%. The rest is council tax, which you instruct councils as to the limits within which they can set rates, and also includes non-domestic rates, which you set the rate for. Parliament approves it. So, I mean, none of that 42% in relationship to tax is tax that local authorities have control over.
They can set. I mean, there may be a cap on council tax, but they've still got some freedom within that cap. And the point is that of all that revenue raising of non-NDR and council tax, that is raised and goes directly to local authorities.
But fiscal autonomy is not just about who owns the revenue, it's about their power to set rates and design the tax system.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, and that's why, though, this is joint work that's ongoing between government and local government as well, and the agreement of local government has been essential for the work that Kate has progressed, alongside the other pillars of work that we're taking forward. So, again, I think the openness is there to kind of thoroughly consider options, because this is a joint oversight between ourselves and local government. So it's not something that we're trying to kind of superimpose onto local government. This is a joint endeavour overseen by both ourselves and COSLA. Yeah,
I'm just wondering what the government's view is.
Yeah, the government's view is quite simple. We're taking forward this work this year, and as part of that, if COSLA and local authorities have proposals to make, then we will discuss and work through them.
Okay, thank you.
And likewise as well, the committee. Sorry.
Yep.
I was just think likewise the committee, if the committee have particular views about the types of things you'd like to see, that's an offer that's open as well about what you would like to see within the local governance review. You've got also represent communities as well about the types of things that you would like to see following the scrutiny you've done in this budget. That's something that you should be thinking and considering feeding into.
I think it will be. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, Convener. Just want to pick up on something that Andy Whiteman said there. And, there was mention of the workplace parking levy, which is, of course, optional for councils. But given that we're doing pre-budget scrutiny, when you draw up your budget for local authorities, will there be an expectation that they will use that levy, or will they be penalised if they don't?
No. These are additional revenue-raising powers for local authorities. They are optional for local authorities, for every local authority.
Right. So the settlement won't take any account of that? So if
Nope.
they choose to use it, it'll be extra money?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's clear enough. Can I ask you about something the committees that, well, we've actually asked you, Cabinet Secretary, about it before, and that's the budget for adaptations for registered social landlords. It's been frozen at £10 million for 7 years, and the committee in its letter to you made a specific ask that that budget be increased in your next budget. Is that something that you're prepared to consider?
Well, and if part of your response back to us through the budget process is for us to increase it, then of course we'll look at all the recommendations from the committee. At the moment, this is part of the wider considerations of the overall budget, and we've talked through the challenges that we have at this present time to have the budget imminently upon us. So yeah, it will be part of the consideration in the context of those wider discussions. But you know, again, we understand the concerns that the committee have, and you raised them last time, and there is of course the ongoing kind of demographic challenges that we face, so there will be an ongoing need for adaptations to happen. So I think, you know, last year we also talked around how we can make better use of the funding pots because they sit over a number of different places as well, and how we might want to think about making that a bit more clear and transparent as well. And again, that will be part of those wider discussions, more in a policy sense than just simply looking at it from the budgetary sense. Yeah.
I mean, we've been talking about preventative spending. This is one way of really good use of money for preventative spending.
Absolutely. And also, though, as well, about how we future-proof the delivery of the houses that we have, that they're adaptable ready, that they are understanding of the people's life, you know, when if they get older, what their needs will be when they get older, so that the houses are suitable as well. So there's not just about the adaptation, kind of retrofitting adaptations, there's also about making sure that what we build is fit for purpose moving forward as well.
Yeah. Can I take it, I'm not asking you to tell us what the budget is, obviously, you can't do that, but can I take it you're sympathetic to that ask?
Well, I think everyone, I think the points that you make are robust, that there is, you know, a need to make sure that adaptations happen to enable people to live in their houses and homes for longer. What I am saying, though, is that this will have to be part of that wider consideration and discussion at the budget. So we're not in a position to kind of give you any figures, but we also need to look at the policy more holistically as well, which I think has also been a call that has been made on us too.
Okay. Can I move on to IJBs, because we've taken quite a bit of evidence on this, specifically, well, sort of a couple of areas really, around a perceived imbalance of power between councils and health boards, and we took some evidence from Unison on that. If I could just read out what Unison told us. They said most councils have a policy of making no compulsory redundancies, but the NHS's policy is to make no redundancies at all. And we heard that cuts within an IJB must be achieved through council redundancies, and this has a disproportionate effect on the social workers and others who work in that area. Their jobs are more vulnerable, and there seems to be a view from evidence that we've heard that health boards, the power seems to lie with health boards rather than councils in this relationship. The other thing that we've been looking at is the finances of these IJBs is almost quite murky. Nobody seems to be able to drill down into who's spending what. We had a number of sessions on this. I know that the Health and Sport Committee are also looking at this. So it's around the need for greater transparency and that disproportionate balance of power. So there's a couple of areas there, if you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, and I again, you know, that these are entities that have been designed to bring about the kind of collaboration and partnership work to improve outcomes for communities. And you know, I know that the Health Committee is also looking at this as well, and there's also work within government as well to make sure that there is the progressive integration happens in a way that is acceptable to all parties as well, to increase the effectiveness of integration, but also to ensure that the outcomes that are being the motivation behind that integration are delivered as well. So I can promise and pledge to get back to you on some of those issues around the employment practices. I think there might just be differences in kind of setups, and some of this might be just that practice has inevitably kind of caused possibly some understandings that are frustrating for one. However, we want to make sure that we'll come back to you on those points as well, and make sure that there's the clarity that you require, and make sure that as well that we understand what the work that the Health Committee does is complementary to the work that you're doing here too.
Good. Talk to the finances, because obviously the Scottish Government works with integration authorities to publish quarterly consolidated financial reports, and these would give details of financial performance, including information of funding held in reserves, and those can all be found on the Scottish Government's website. So obviously, whilst integration authorities are responsible for managing and delivering the financial balance for the health and social care responsibilities, they do have a requirement to produce audited accounts as well as annual performance reports to detail allocations of funding from partner bodies and how it's been spent. But I should also say that whilst it is for the local partners to negotiate and agree their budgets together in a timely manner, we do want to work with partners to better integrate those financial arrangements, and that's happening as part of the ministerial steering group review with looking at the process of integration. And there's clear guidance for partners when developing integration schemes to set out their arrangements particularly for risk sharing between bodies, including managing over or underspends. Now, each integration authority has those arrangements in place, but they do need to be revised every 5 years, and I'm aware that some areas are looking at to further establish those arrangements that they have in place.
There also was the report that the Ministerial Strategic Group for Health and Community Care that published in February this year as well, and at that point there wasn't, and they're working through the recommendations from that as well. Workforce, the issues that you described around workforce, I'm not sure that that was as prominent as maybe the information you've got in the committee sessions. However, there is workforce planning, a work stream that's looking at improving anything on that front as well.
So the ministerial steering group review, when's that due to complete?
I don't know, but I can get back to you on a date.
Right.
I'm not involved with it, but I can get back to you on a date.
Okay, thanks.
I'd like to come in on the back of that. And the evidence that we've received, and to be fair, we are the local government communities committee, is that the stumbling block tends to be in almost every department seems to be the health board, the one that seems less welcoming of the whole partnership idea seems to be the health board, and that's a real concern for us. I mean, we can't have local governments, extra pressure being put on local governments if the health board are not fulfilling their part of the deal as well. What method is there? I know you talked about the finance reports, but what method is there for the government to sort of make sure that what should be happening, a good, fair partnership between the two of them to benefit the people they might be serving, is taking place?
And I think that will be a number of ways as well. You know, again, the national, I talked about the national performance framework. That's not just something that's for local and national government. That's for many players in public life as well, to make sure they focus on outcomes. The local governance review also has Jean Freeman sitting at it because of the importance that health plays, and it's local governance, not local government. So again, the leadership from government to ensure that health boards are playing their full role within the IJB setting is essential. And again, if there are things that are coming through from the committee's budgetary scrutiny, we'll endeavour to follow those up. But from again, we can point to lots of examples where health are playing a very full and proactive part. So the local governance review, health is there. The public health priorities, that's a shared endeavour between health and local government to, again, going back to some of those previous questions, looking at the preventative spend, looking at how we can support public health priorities, because that takes away the need for spending money at the acute end of the health service. So there's lots of ways in which health boards are playing their part, and of course the health service has people out in the communities delivering service, going over the threshold of people's doors, whether that's midwives, health visitors, whole host podiatrists, whole host of different people who are playing their role within a community setting. So I don't think we should lose sight of that. either within the narrative of what we're trying to create through the integration work.
And I completely accept that and agree with that. And the health service obviously does a lot of great work, but when we're talking about the IGBs, I think it's really important. I'm a great supporter of them, and I think that they're the way forward, but they only work if all the partners are willing to work together, and some of the evidence we've got suggests that's not always the case.
Convener, good morning, Cabinet Secretary Minister. Just picking up on that issue, I mean, we really have had quite a lot of comment in evidence sessions about the functioning of IJBs. And a point that frequently has been made is that actually some are functioning really, really well, okay, and some are not functioning really, really well. And pending, you know, reviews and outcomes of reviews and implementing reviews, surely there must be a way to take control of this situation, whoever it is that would lead, and say who's working well, who isn't working well, what can we do in the interim as a matter of practicality to seek to improve pending perhaps wider structural changes that may or may not come about further to this ongoing review. Would that not be a practical way forward?
Absolutely, and again, and probably remiss of me for not to say something like that, because that was part of the answer to the question you had around absenteeism. There is always that opportunity to share good practice, to kind of share learning, to work with other IGBs to flush out where good outcomes are being delivered and where challenges have been met, and how that learning can be shared. So yeah, absolutely, that's a proactive and positive way in which the potential disparity in performance may be addressed. And that's the same for much of public life as well, whether that's 32 local authorities or different departments within a local authority as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yep, I'd like to move us on to climate change. We took quite a lot of evidence from witnesses about climate change, and obviously there are two major areas in terms of local government. One is our transport and one is our buildings, and local government has pretty significant influence on both. We got lots of evidence back on the extent to which councils are working on promoting carbon neutrality, and just as an opening question, I'd like to ask how you are going to work to assess to what extent councils are working on carbon neutrality and what they're delivering, and to think about what further measures are needed to put in place.
And there is already consultation ongoing around the role of the public sector in responding to the global climate emergency. And our proposals also include all public bodies, so that includes councils in making both their targets and their progress towards them available publicly, so the residents can see how well they're performing. And that consultation is open until the start of next month, because, like you say, it's very important that local authorities take forward their work on carbon neutrality as much as everyone else does. However, if the committee wants further information on that, I'm kind of quite conscious as well that that sits in another part of government as well, and we'll endeavour to flush out further information if you want it. But at the moment there's an ongoing consultation with about the role of public sector in responding to that challenge. That closes at the end of next month, and they'll be looking at the information that comes back on that.
I think we would be interested in that, because it's very relevant to the next question I was going to ask, which was about what funding is going to be able to enable councils to implement the climate change targets as set out in the 2019 programme for government. And I'm thinking about that particularly in relation to transport and to buildings, and the issue of skills and knowledge. We've got the heat networks bill coming forward, but planning is not a core issue. You've mentioned at the start of your comments today about core services getting the funding they need. But planning, we know, is critical in terms of the climate change agenda, and it's within the unprotected budget, and it's an additional set of skills and knowledge that are needed on top of what's happening now. And then there's how you would promote community heat networks, where you don't have the skills and resource in local authorities. We can almost name the fantastic work that's been done by some local authorities, but it's not universal and it's not across all councils. And then there's the opportunity for councils to engage in bus services. That was something that came through in the transport bill that we just passed a few weeks ago. So 3 areas where really innovative work is needed, totally new work. So how do you fund that, and what will the Scottish Government do in terms of knowledge and funding to enable local authorities to take the leadership we know they need at the community level?
Yeah, and in terms of things, for instance, on planning, there's, following the planning bill, there's, we'll be consulting shortly on planning fees and performance as well towards the end of this year, and that can look at those issues around working through increased fees for retrospective applications and all those things that had been discussed through the planning bill. So again, that would be, I think the principle of that was to ensure that then there could enable improved performance linked to that. I know that there was discussion around how that might be used within your evidence sessions as well. Again, that would be up to local authorities. However, we would want to be able to further engage on what's appropriate in terms of planning fees and cost recovery on that issue. On issues around building and the skills that were required, Professor Sean Smith did a review of the building skills that will be necessary, and also thinking about how the industry more generally around what types of buildings and infrastructure are we constructing, and do we have the skills that are necessary and also resilient to future challenges, and also the current climate change challenge as well. So again, that's been looked at around how we kind of gear up to ensure that we have the right skills in place to build the right things in the right way to make good on those carbon challenges. And I think you're right, there is other ways in which we can think about critically around the transport provision of the budget as well, and how we can embed much more innovative thinking in practice. However, some of this again is locked up into the budget discussions that will have to happen. But when you have a climate emergency that is declared, then that means that we have to think about things imaginatively, innovatively, differently. We can't just continue as we are. Otherwise, that would be no response to what is an emergency that we're facing. So a lot of that will be caught up in the budget discussions that will be happening.
Right. I suppose the critical issue, I suppose, here is that the first half of the evidence session today has been about core services, about priorities, areas where councils are under pressure. And this is areas where they're really going to have to step up their work and do things that are not currently being done by local authorities, or are only being done by very few.
Absolutely.
So there's a huge knowledge transformation, but there's also a risk issue. If you're developing heat networks, it's hugely desirable if it's low carbon, but there are also financial risks involved, and it's making sure that local authorities can learn from each other, from past experience, or from other countries where certain countries are way ahead of us, 20 years ahead of us. So it's how you frame that with local authorities. So very keen to see this in the budget. So the process would be in the run-up to the budget in terms of seeing whether you'd be putting new resources in. Because I asked the Cabinet, to cut the chase, I asked the Cabinet Secretary for Environment and Climate Change recently, and she said, we've got a settlement with COSLA. That's where we deal with these things. And I just reflected at the time, given the nature of the climate emergency, the big ticket changes you'll be looking for, that it's not within the existing financial framework that councils are operating with, or staff.
But it's part of the budget discussions that we'll be having as well around how what the settlement will end up being, and where they prioritise how they use their spending. And the fact of the matter is that we have a statutory target to reach around some of this thing, so that has to drive forward progress across all of public life as well, not just local authorities. Again, that's why we're consulting the role of public sector and how they respond to that, and that closes again like at the end of next month. And so we have to then consider all those responses and work out what are the things that we can do, that we have to do differently to support the targets that Rosanna Cunningham has set out and has within the legislation, and also what does that mean for more generally day-to-day life. So that will be part of the discussions that happen, and it'll be up to then local authorities to then deliver on that through the budget settlement that ends up being agreed to. But there's also other ways, I think, that there could be ways to look at this around community planning partnerships. Is there a way for them to discuss things around bringing all together the people who are making decisions on communities? Is there ways for that to be a body for them to discuss the climate change that will impact upon their communities that they serve? The Leadership Forum, the Scottish Leaders Forum, also has climate change as one of the priority bits of work stream that's been taken forward. Again, that brings together all the leaders from local authorities, from our health boards across the whole of public life, about what more do they need to do to respond to the challenge that has been set out. So it's a priority that's set out from government, and it's a priority of Scottish leaders, and you know, again, these will be discussions through the budget process around what then is attributed by individual local authorities to meet that challenge.
Okay, that really squares with all the evidence we got from our witnesses, that work was needed. So I suppose what you're saying is we have to look to the budget for that and wait and see.
Yeah, but also, like I said, you know, this is currently a work stream from the Scottish Leaders Forum. This is a work stream that's getting taken forward by them to make sure that they are responding adequately as in public life. It's led by Colin Sinclair, from Chief Executive of NSS, and Sally Loudon, who's the Chief Executive of COSLA. So that's been led from the front by our leaders within public life to work out what they do as the public sector to respond to the challenge, alongside the work that we're doing to consult with them around what are the practical issues that they need to change, how they need to change what they do, what they need to fund, what they need to think about differently, where they might have had existing commitments. Does that tally up with the fact that we now have a very pressing climate change needs and problem to address? Does that mean that we have to rethink where we've prioritised spending in the past and think about that differently? And also, how do we do that alongside looking through the lens of child poverty and not embed further inequalities more generally, making sure that that transition into a low-carbon economy is a just one?
Okay, a very specific question to end on, and that's about the vehicle charging network, which local authorities are already heavily involved in. And the evidence that we've had is that if we are going to step up the use and demand for electric vehicles, which could be cars, buses, bikes, then you need the charging points. And although we have some infrastructure there, it's not going to meet future needs and future demand. So again, it's an update on your plans to expand the vehicle charging network.
And there has been a commitment in the programme for government to continue to support charging up to 2022, and there's a commitment to support the creation of 20 electric trams across the country. We've now got over 1,200 charge points available, and the £20 million funding that was announced earlier this year will see another 800 charge points added to that network. And we're also working with local authorities, Scottish Power, Energy Networks, SSE and others to also work out what more and how we work collaboratively to deliver on that aspiration. But again, I'm conscious that it's not sitting necessarily within my portfolio wholly, so if there are further things you want to probe and test on that, we'll happily get back to you on that one.
Yeah, would be very interested because it links very directly to planning. If you're building new houses, if you're extending communities, that infrastructure is crucial, not just from day one, but so that people can see it before they actually move in.
Absolutely,
and that they can invest accordingly.
No, and you're absolutely right. So I think, you know, there's funding there, there's existing kind of networks and infrastructure there in place. There's an ambition to do more with funding attached to it, and that work is ongoing along with the energy providers, network operators as well, to work out how we do that and deliver that as well. But you're right, how does that then link into the housing up to 2040? Do we have the right infrastructure built around that? Do we need to do more there? Do we need to have much more in terms of planning embedded to make sure that people can live the life that we're expecting them to live to cope with the climate emergency that's upon us? So it's not just solely one portfolio, but I'm conscious that Ms Cunningham has more of the specifics around the particular points around chargeable points.
Yeah. I think I take all that. I'm just conscious of the fact that we've got communities expanding now, or new communities being built now, and when you think of the 2040 perspective, you know, that infrastructure, it's the opportunity to do it now, as opposed to the big agenda that you rightly mentioned about retrofitting.
And it's,
I want to move on from this, but
I just want to say though, while I'm...
Hold on a second,
sorry,
please.
okay.
What we'll do is we can write to Ms Cunningham and see what information we can get back, very briefly.
Sorry,
please.
Convener, no, I was just saying, although that the housing work that we're doing is up to 2040, that doesn't mean that we just do the work at the end of 2040. It's about ongoing work, and again, that came through in the evidence you got around if you want to change systems, you need to do it over a timescale as well. It won't happen overnight. And again, that's in response to, as you'll know, the housing sector looking for that more longer term certainty over what they have to build, how they have to build it, and what they need to gear up to. So it's not just a big bang at the end of 2040 and suddenly we'll have a new system. This is ongoing work as well, and, you know, incremental work, but that culture change that's necessary.
Okay, thank you. Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. The committee have heard in evidence already that the procurement rules and practices that are in place are quite challenging. and these rules and practices were brought into place to try and support and assist and improve. But what we have heard is that they are maybe creating barriers, and these barriers are within the rules and the processes are in themselves ensuring or not ensuring that there's effective service delivery across the piece. So it would be good to get the government's view on that.
Yeah, again, and that's something that you've brought up as well, and I can understand that there will be frustrations. However, the procurement legislation has been designed to enable it to be flexible and to respond to issues around how do we ensure that we get more SMEs in the pipeline, how do we support our local businesses as well. And the changes that we've brought about through the legislation have been designed to try and do some of that. So if there are particular frustrations, then it would be good if there was more detail and clarity about where those have been, so we can work through what those are, because we also hear that there is a bit of a risk aversion within some of the within public life around how they can use procurement to deliver on wider aspiration. And it might be, again, going back to Annabel Ewan's point about that sharing of good practice and how we can learn from one another as well, where people are doing good things. The other thing I would point to, which I think is particularly interesting, is the work that's ongoing in Ayrshire around the community wealth building. And I had a really informative meeting with a councillor from Preston around the work that they've done. But it's been really interesting now to see the development of that community wealth building approach happening in North Ayrshire and across the whole Ayrshire, all three Ayrshires, linking that community wealth building, using procurement, using all those tools to build embed fair work practices, or to make sure that they tackle inequality, to make sure that they have the communities benefiting from the public money that's in the system, and also linking that to the regional deals as well. So there's an example of where there has been imaginative, innovative use to deliver services, to use procurement, but to use procurement in a really imaginative way that actually delivers along a whole host of other outcomes.
Because you've identified there that there are real opportunities. That I've indicated that there are challenges, but there are real opportunities to develop and expand that whole process to ensure that you do get the value and the support mechanism. So do you think it requires some redesigning? Do you think it requires some restructuring to ensure that that does take place? Because obviously there are, as you've identified, some councils that are really quite forward-thinking and quite progressive about what they're trying to achieve, where others seem to be averse to trying to go down that. But if there was a bit of a redesign, would that support them all to feel more confident?
It possibly could. However, the other thing is that people are being bold and imaginative within the existing structure. So there's clearly no hindrance or barrier there to some. So what is it that has been the enabler there in that local authority or those local authorities to try out different things to support their third sector, their SMEs? And we have, at national level, some good statistics around how many SMEs are being able to get to interact with the procurement system as well. But if there is risk aversion, how do we support that? How do we enable them to be enlightened by other local authorities that are doing some interesting things? And already I think the work that's happening in Ayrshire has triggered some thoughts from other local authorities into how they would best use their city deal money and how they might look at this in a different way. And for me that's really important, because the other parts of my portfolio are around how do we meet poverty targets, how do we reduce inequality, how do we improve people's life chances through enable them to access work and employment that is paid fairly. So if all of those things can be achieved through some imaginative use of procurement, then that means that again it has to be something that we support, and we would point to, I think, the Ayrshires for doing some really quite creative
because, as
thinking.
I say, that many submissions suggested that the whole transformation strategy and the redesign of potential the way going forward, I think, is the best way for us to try and manage the situation. And as I said, you have identified the need there. But within all of that, there's an envelope of money, there's a budget constraint. There's all of that that needs to be managed to ensure that they feel that they can and they do have the opportunity to develop and expand. And some of them, obviously, because of the way they are looking at their communities and how that impacts the communities and where they believe they should be taking the community, but they don't have that confidence yet to progress that. And the whole procurement issue then becomes more of a, as I say, a barrier than an enabler. And we want it to be an enabler.
Absolutely.
Because the enabling is what needs to take place.
I would agree. I was about to say presiding officer, but it was chair. Sorry, I would agree with Alexander Stewart, and you know, again, I would just point to the fact that there is some good practice ongoing, but possibly the thing that we need to focus on is the risk aversity within the system that's not enabling some of that to happen across all areas as well.
Thank you.
And as we draw near the close of our session, we finish leaving the best to last, and Annabelle Ewing has a couple of questions.
What's his campaign for presiding officer started already? Okay, just picking up nicely from where Alexander Stewart was getting to. We had a really interesting session with Professors Kenneth Gibb and James Mitchell, and looking at potential alternative models of delivery and the way forward, and trying to pick up on all the good points that CAPSEC was making about, you know, how we unlock the potential that's out there and get people working together. And indeed, a point that's come across quite frequently and picks up also the IGB debate is, you know, the silo working. Everybody works in their silo. How do we get people out of their silos? And indeed, Professor Mitchell commented, and I quote, "One of the problems is that we appoint to such institutions in silos, train in silos and work in silos." And he went on to advocate a stick and carrot approach rather than one he termed sermonising. So I just wonder, how do we, you know, that is an interesting idea. How do we get to a better place? How do we get out of the silo working? Because that seems to actually affect, it's a culture, and that affects really any you know, exciting initiatives that can be proposed. Nonetheless, in the implementation, it seems to go back into this silo culture. And one issue that he suggested was incentivisation. I think picking up on Mr. Whiteman's comment a wee while back, and it'd be interesting to hear a wee bit further from the Minister on that issue in terms of the accounting and so forth, because in terms of human nature, we know that incentivising human beings, you know, is more likely to reap reward in all manner of ways. And I'm sorry, this is a wee bit kind of a broad brush approach, Convener, but I think it's really important because in the end of the day, you are relying on individuals to provide the service. So how do we do this going forward? How do we do it in a different way to get more consistent and
I'll maybe kick off with some, and I think again I might point again to the early years collaborative as one way where that did fundamentally break down some of those barriers and brought people together, regardless of whether they were NHS or council or government or third sector, to focus in on the needs of the child. So I think, you know, that person-centred approach, those principles are really important in terms of trying to break through some of the silos. Another area that I would point to as well, is breaking down some of the silos, because I've seen it happen in real life, was when we apply the place principle, which has been adopted by the government and local authorities, and that focusing on a place as opposed to a focusing on what health services do we provide to this community, and not thinking around, well, what other things are going on, or what education provision is in that community, thinking about the holistic needs of the place, that being the driver, which then breaks through and breaks down through some of those silos as well. And hopefully will also align some of the funding streams as well. So if you're building houses, what do you need around that? And how do you meet the climate change targets? So what do you do in terms of active travel around those houses as well? How do you align all of those funding streams and that opportunity in a more sensible way? And again, so that for me, the sense of place is something that I can see breaking down the silos. I suppose the question is then, how do we make that happen as business as usual? And I think that's probably the next step, is how you get that from happening to be, how you get that from being pockets of good practice to actually being something that is the norm. But person-centred services, the place-based approach, and also there is, again, I mentioned the Leaders Forum in response to Sarah Boyack because of the work that they're taking forward around a work stream on climate change, but there's also a work stream on incentives as well, which might unpick some further opportunity for different approaches as well. But I think I would point to those couple of things as being what I've seen to be the ways in which we can try and bulldoze through some of that siloed mentality. And the Early Years Collaborative, really fundamental in empowering the front line to make quite substantial decisions that enable them to challenge further up the pecking order about and question the I-bean culture that had maybe been present in the past.
So I'm very interested in the whole concept of incentivisation because I think it moves us away from talking about inputs to outcomes. And whilst we can all discuss that sort of rhetorically, incentives actually make that shift. And whilst we may all agree across the public sector, certainly between Scottish Government and COSLA, on what the outcomes should be, such as improving people's lives, actually linking that to the sort of more tangible outcomes that we want to see is something that I would be very interested in exploring further. I think it also drives more collaboration, as you say, in getting out of silos. When you've got two organisations, it goes right back to the point earlier about recycling efficiencies or savings when one organisation has generated them and one hasn't. It drives more collaboration. So I suppose my commitment could be to certainly doing some preliminary considerations within government on that, but I think more critically discussing it with COSLA. And I think the place to do that, if it's not in this budget process, will be through the local governance review. But it's certainly a conversation I will happily have with COSLA as part of our discussions on funding.
Okay, well, that's positive. Thank you for that. Sorry?
So I was going to add in as well, in a kind of practical sense, that an example of where the place principle has worked to transform has been the Clyde Gateway, and that has brought together housing, health, the community, the police, the women's library, a whole host of different players that have fundamentally regenerated that area, provided opportunity. The community feel heartened by that because what they're seeing is not just projectitis that they've experienced in the past when they've been promised lots and never seen any change, but the Clyde Gateway approach has transformed that area, done it with and alongside the community as opposed to them, and has started to see the opportunities become apparent in terms of employment, new housing, new things that had never would have previously, I think, wanted to have settled in the East End of Glasgow. And I think that type of approach is where you start to see the real benefit of focusing in on a place and what that place needs and delivering services according to that, as opposed to doing it on your own because you need to meet a target for housing or you need to build a new road. In isolation. Okay, maybe a potential future visit. I think it would be a good...
Excuse me, we are over time.
Yeah,
so
I've just got one last point to make, and it's the suggestion of the Robertson Trust of the model of social bridging finance, and I won't ask the government ministers to go into that in detail today, but what I would like to ask is that this is essentially a model that brings together public sector, third sector and independent funders, and the independent funders apparently the risk is taken by them not in terms of financial return but in terms of social impact. I think the Robertson Trust is currently carrying out an evaluation of this model. What I would ask both of you is that you would undertake to have a greater look at this and consider and reflect upon it to see to what extent it would be appropriate to help promote this in relevant economic areas of activity, because it does sound to me very interesting idea.
Absolutely, and we currently support a lot of the work that the Robertson Trust do, so that would be an easy thing for us to pledge to do, to make sure that we work with them and understand their approach and to take out any future learning.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
That'd be great, thanks very much. Thank you, Annabelle. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and Minister for attending today's session. We look forward to seeing the Government's response to our letter in due course, and at least we know what some of it will be in it. Thank you very much. I suspend to allow a witness changeover and to establish a video link. Okay. Agenda item 3 is an evidence session on building regulations and fire safety in Scotland. And today I welcome Laura Hughes, General Insurance Manager, Association of British Insurers, Craig Ross, Associate Director of the Built Environment, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and Professor Jose Torrero, Professor of Civil Engineering and Head of Department, University College London, and Dr Jim Glockling, Technical Director of Fire Protection Association. Dr Glockling is on video link, and we will need to be mindful of the possible slight delays down the line during our discussion. Can you hear me all right, Dr Glockling?
I can indeed. Thank you very much. Seems to work very well.
Right, thank you for your time. Given the size and the panel at the time available, we'll move straight on to questions from members, and I'll ask Sarah Boyatt to kick off.
Many thanks. It's good to have witnesses here with us today, and we've also had quite a lot of submissions in advance of our session, which has been incredibly helpful. I just want to kick off with a very basic question at the start. Do current Scottish building standards requirements, particularly as they apply to new build high-rise domestic buildings, offer sufficient protection to residents from fire? And if not, what changes would you like to see introduced? So it's open to any of the panel to kick off.
I'm happy to kick off. The ABI, the Association of British Insurers, we represent the insurance industry, property insurers across the UK, and are really keen on making sure that buildings are safe from fire. We have recognised in the past and today that Scottish Government has a robust regulations, especially compared to the regulations that have been in England, and examples such as the mandatory installation of sprinklers in care homes and some of the changes that you've put in, the government's put in following Grenfell, such as reducing the trigger height down to 11 metres for combustible cladding. So there's been, from our perspective, Scottish Government has got some very robust regulations, but having said that, the main issue that we find of concern is the fact that Scottish Government continues to allow BS 8414 test, which is essentially still allowing materials of limited combustibility on buildings over 11 metres as they can pass the test. And the ABI commissioned the FPA back in 2017 following Grenfell to do some research into the fundamentals of BS 8414, and the research clearly demonstrates that the test is not currently appropriate for the real world conditions that we see cladding being put on buildings. I'm sure there'll be more on that later on, but that's sort of the main issue that the ABI believes needs to be changed in Scotland. There's also, various concerns or requirements needed around some of the changes we've seen in England with Dame Judith Hackett confirming the need for a golden thread. Some of the work that Scottish Government have done on the inventory is a really great step. I think more of that is what we need in the future as well.
Okay, thank you. Do other witnesses have comments?
Yes, please. So, first of all, thank you very much for the invite to speak on behalf of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. It's also personally great to be back in home soil and speaking about this very important topic in our Parliament. I'd like to say, as you may know, RICS covers 22 different professional pathways to membership and around 135,000 members. So it's a very diverse organisation. From one person to speak with consensus on behalf of everybody, can be difficult. We've therefore produced and submitted a written statement on zero evaluation and cladding that you should have received. I believe that was submitted yesterday. So questions on that document, and indeed any questions that I feel would merit a more measured and encompassing response, I would like to take back to RICS and make sure you've got a detailed response as soon as possible. Through our combined expertise and primary objective of working in the public interest, we've been heavily involved in both the post-Grenfell fire safety work in England, and have also representatives in the coal and Stollard report in Scotland. We remain ready to assist the committee in this important safety issue. Moving on to your question, currently combustible materials, as Laura mentioned, are permitted if the relevant person opts to use a BS 8414 test. I would say that properties in fire start for a number of reasons, and there are still typically around 40 fire-related deaths in Scotland attributable to occupation activities. It's therefore difficult to say that cladding and insulation systems will inhibit fires altogether, and indeed there's no one panacea that will solve the problem. Current building standards designed to address cladding and insulation issues will reduce risk in cladding and insulation, but passive and active fire protection measures are all part of reducing the fire risk spread once started. BS 8414 is currently considered for cladding solutions, and while this test is useful, we feel it could be improved to include more realistic scenarios. Another issue to consider with BS 841 tests, there are limited testing facilities available for that particular test at the moment, perhaps only 3 in the UK. And the estimated cost for carrying out those tests is between £40,000 and £60,000, with a 12 to 18-month waiting period. So obviously that does create issues for that particular test. But we support the moves that have been made by the Scottish Building Standards. And thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to start by saying that I struggle with your question, and I think because, and particularly in light of the responses of my two esteemed colleagues, we discuss very much details of building regulations, and we talk about details of testing regimes, and I think the fundamental problem is not that. The fundamental problem is that when you have a set of building regulations, when you have a set of building technologies that are put in place, for the system to actually work correctly, you have to have competent professionals that actually are capable of using these tools appropriately. It is not the test that is bad, and it's not the regulation that is bad. It is the use of the regulation and the use of the test that is actually bad. In the hands of a competent professional, regulations can be supplemented. Regulations can be understood and ambiguities can be filled. But in the absence of competent professionals, none of those things happen, and then mistakes are made. In a similar manner, there is no perfect test, and BS 8414 can be used appropriately, or it can be used inappropriately. It depends on the user more than on the test itself. And I think the problem is that current building technologies, particularly when it comes to high-rises, have evolved in a manner such that they require a high level of competency. And Scotland doesn't really have a proper definition of competency when it comes to fire safety. And therefore, in the absence of that proper definition of competency, it is impossible to establish how to do an appropriate assessment of a building and how to do an appropriate design, and who actually is doing things correctly and who is not doing things correctly.
Okay, these were actually going to be my following two questions. Have you got something you wanted to come in on? I was going to come on to the verification procedures.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, if possible, I'd just like to really continue on with just to detail some of the work that we've actually done on 8414 testing. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. But since Grenfell, between ABI, Risk Authority and the FPA, insurers contributed best part of £500,000 to actually understand better the standards that go into really authenticating material usage on buildings. The reasons are perhaps slightly different to others. Obviously, insurers need clarity when determining what the estimated maximum loss might be in any given building. And fire, unique to other perils, has really the capability of exceeding these limits very quickly if nasty surprises arise. So the work that we've done is very independent. It was a fresh eyes look at the standards with no remit. In actual fact, insurers love us to actually say there's no problem at the end of the day, rather than saying that there might be a problem. But we conducted many tests on 8414 scale, looking at its capability to assure fire performance from an insurance perspective, and really concluded that whilst a better test than many out there, development was really needed to meet this remit. The research then continued. We found a discontinuity really between the building regulations as they currently stand, looking at the fire stopping in the external envelope of the building, and the toxic hazard that can be presented by some of these systems. And we feel there that there's further work required to assure that there is appropriate separation of occupant from the toxic hazard that can be generated. Now, the key points of these tests, it really comes down to, it's not a bad test, but it's not developed enough to ensure that real life is replicated at the end of the day. And it is possible that following a failure, certain rearrangements of materials rather than selection of different materials can be done to ensure, to create a pass of such a test. Now, this suggests that design detailing is critical to performance, and we need to ask ourselves whether these details are realistic, practical, and representative eventually of what goes on the building at the end of the day, to mirror something that some of your other presenters have said. But if I had to summarise, really, this has been used as a test of materials rather than a test of system. It's usually commissioned by product manufacturers rather than the end user or specifier. And as such, often important materials such as membranes get omitted from these tests. And obviously we know things like vapour membranes can spread fire faster than cavity barriers can respond, and this we feel is an important feature. It also omits some very important features, such as the presence of plastic ducts and vents, which don't have to be fire stopped in the external envelope of the building. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But I think if we, and the final thing is really the scale of the test is somewhat wrong, in that the fire is the same width as the cavity barriers, and so therefore this can lead to airtight closure of a void, which in a much larger building, broader footprint, wouldn't actually be the case at the end of the day. So really, test installations, and then I mean the test installations, can end up over-robust, oversimplified, over-sealed, and resulting in an over-favourable outcome. Now, a lot of these are about realism. We test many systems in our laboratories, and currently all our rigs are tied up looking at current buildings and assessing whether what's on them is okay. And I was really heartened to see that just today, I don't know whether it was the building owner or the local authority on whose behalf the test was being done, but they asked for the whole system to be removed and re-put on properly so that it correctly mirrored the building. And I think we're heading in the right direction. I'll really just finish off by saying that I think there is a key feature which is missed in all this testing, and the presence of ducts and vents, plastic ducts and vents, does not form part of a fire test, but as some fire stop devices, they do form a route for both fire ingress and fire egress from the building, which is not considered. And as such, we are seeing in many building methods fire ingress and fire straight into the void, where there may be combustible structure or combustible insulation to be a key feature. So I think really that sort of sums up the research that we've done to date and the criticisms that we have. I entirely agree that honestly used things is where the root of where many of the problems are. But at the end of the day, I think there are some key issues with scale and how the test actually gets conducted.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful. It's interesting getting a different take on the actual process of testing. And different views on that, so I think that's worth reflecting on. I'm also going to have to read that transcript afterwards because I couldn't. You were probably totally articulate at your end. I couldn't completely hear that. I don't know if it's just where I'm sitting in the room. So I'm going to read your evidence afterwards again. That's just a commitment there. I have a follow-up question, which was to go back to the point you made about the skills and knowledge of people involved in this technical process. And that was about the verification procedures, whether they're robust enough to ensure that fire safety requirements are being met in practice. And in that, I was thinking about the skills and knowledge of the people carrying out that test, and the different stages in the process in terms of the commissioning of works. Do people commission the right fire safety requirements in the first place? How are they constructed? And then on completion, so at what point is there actual testing, and what point have we got the skills through each of those processes, which is not just about the checking in terms of the verification, but also the construction and the oversight process, and whether that's happening in our buildings. So it kind of comes back to the point that you made, I think, at the very start about the skills and knowledge.
When the design and build of modern construction systems is extremely complex nowadays, and it has some very simple components and some very, very complex components. And some of them are very easy to verify. Some of them are extremely complicated to verify because they have been already encapsulated and enclosed in a manner such that it's very difficult to see. So to be able to provide a proper verification, there are certain things for which you probably can do it at the end of the process by an individual with very basic level of competency. For example, verifying that self-closing mechanisms in doors work. All you have to do is look at it, verify that it works, and it takes a little bit of experience and common sense. When it comes to systems like cladding or sprinkler systems or many other systems, then the level of competency is much higher. In some cases, like in the case of sprinkler systems, we have methods that enables us to verify the system correctly and see if it works correctly. But for example, in the case of cladding, the process has to be done during the construction process, because once the system is completely enclosed and sealed, you will have to break it apart to be able to understand if it works or not. When does testing come in this whole process? That is a very difficult question to ask. And some of the points that were being made by Dr. Golub before are quite important, because in the case of cladding, detailing is a very significant aspect of the process, and an aspect, for example, that testing can actually not reproduce. Now, when we provide criticism to tests, we think of them as systems that are there to reproduce reality. And that is not the case. Tests are done in principle to provide evidence or information for competent professionals to be able to make decisions. And therefore, they do not have to reproduce reality. They just have to reproduce conditions that provide adequate information for the competent professionals to be able to make decisions. And when and how this should be done should be part of a process that is driven by competent professionals.
Okay.
If I can maybe expand on that, I think that the problem's exacerbated when it comes to site. So obviously the verifier will make some site inspections, but they're ultimately not responsible for the quality of workmanship on site. That very much comes down to the responsible person. Those particular skills on site, the clerk of works role, for example, has largely been phased out over a period of time for numerous reasons, cost savings, let's say. So there is definitely, we've seen evidence of quality issues on building sites due, I think, partially to the moving away from that lack of the clerk of works role. I had a meeting with Building Standards and Scottish Fire and Rescue Service yesterday, and we discussed how that particular problem can be overcome. So the certifier of compliance role, which was discussed in an outline, or the alternative to that, what they call the construction compliance notification plan, the process by where the applicant will inform the verifier of the complexity of construction, the potential key stages for them to come and inspect, which I think is probably what we would like to see developed. The verifier role, I think, is strong in Scotland. I think it's worth keeping as it is and bolstering through what we'd like to see as a detailed compliance plan.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
I think I'd echo very much the comments from the panel. What we've seen across the UK really is issues with the levels of competence and understanding of the individual roles within the construction process. And I'd agree with Craig Ross that the verifier role does seem to be a strong role. I think there's still a need for clarification on roles and responsibilities, and I think one of the things that the ABI and the insurance industry is keen to see is more detail on the construction process and materials used within a building. So it's my understanding that sort of the inventory that Scottish Government have started is a step towards that. I think there's a need for that to be completed in an electronic format that's available to building owners, to those within the construction process, but also available to the likes of insurers to be able to understand what it is they're actually insuring, and also to the Fire and Rescue Service so they can understand what it is they may be tackling during a fire and therefore may need to change their approach depending on the construction of that building.
Thanks.
Standards to play in this, and actually
could you just repeat that first comment, because could you repeat your first comment because we missed that?
I do apologise. There is a role for standards and the evaluation of the data to play in reducing the burden on competency. Now, in many other areas of certainly protection, you introduce a concept of safety factors. So whilst material structural elements of a building will have a requirement to support so many tonnes, the actual element that goes into the building might have a safety factor of 2. So we can be assured that even if something is wrong, that people drill holes in it throughout its lifetime, it will still probably fulfil it correctly. Now, in the fire industry also, when we test extinguish agents of certain type, it may pass a test at a certain quantity, but then we might ask for a 30% uplift to provide a safety factor for when we encounter things which are deviations from what might be expected in the test. But when it comes to cladding testing, there is no concept of safety factor here. It's just if that configuration passes, then that's all well and good. And so there we do have to recreate realism. Now, we certainly see this when in some of the buildings we've investigated post-fire, where perhaps in light timber frame structures, where a very small hole has been left unfire stopped. We're talking about sort of, a 20 centimetre hole left unfire stopped. That can go on to really breach all the fire resisting capability of the building, and it can end up on the ground. So we have a susceptibility inbuilt on the assumption of perfection in the way that we actually are able to put up buildings, which the current view, given the losses that we're seeing, is that that's not possible or credible. So I think tests can be changed to introduce a requirement that you may test with this configuration, but what goes on in the building needs to be this plus more to account for the imperfect environment that the world is.
Okay, thank you. I suppose the first 2 questions I asked were about what the standards were, whether they were right, then about the verification process. The third question I want to ask is about the role of our local authority building standards departments, because in terms of accountability, transparency, and ensuring that people are abiding by the standards, they're absolutely crucial. So it's your views on to what extent our local authority departments have got the expertise they need. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to the 4 of you giving evidence and thinking, the skills and the knowledge that people need to be able to put that into effect is not just at the construction stage, it's at the regulatory stage as well. How confident are you that we've got that in our local authorities across our 32 councils in Scotland?
I think as a collective pool of 32 local authorities, I think you do have the skills and expertise. The difficulty might be when you're addressing one particular local authority that might not have expertise in, sports stadiums, for example, that would maybe have to draw on expertise from other local authorities. I think having the centralised building standards system in Scotland is strong in that respect, because local authorities can do that, unlike, for example, an approved inspector who, may not go to competition to draw on that expertise south of the border. So I think that there is the expertise in-house, but it's spread countrywide rather than being, within each local authority.
I think this could be improved to build on where we are at the moment.
I think enhance the existing building standard system. Look at, I'm sure in a perfect world, more funding. I'm sure the local authorities would enjoy that. But I think enhancing the existing system rather than looking to alter it drastically, bolstering the capabilities that they have.
Okay, thanks.
Well, Annabelle wants to come in for a brief one. I know you've got a number of questions, Graham, haven't you? Right.
Just to start, thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Just picking up specifically on that point. I mean, obviously, in the Cole report, there was a specific recommendation on the need for, the building standards team not just to check the proposed design, but to check what was actually being built, because I think we have seen in the past that those 2 things, sadly, are not the same. And I just wonder, post Grenfell, post the work of the Scottish Government's Joint Ministerial Working Group on building, get the right title, building and fire safety, the Cole report emanating from that, is anything changing on the ground as far as you're aware, Mr. Ross?
That I've seen, it's not something I can comment on personally, to be honest. And that's the question I'd like to take back to our membership, especially the ones that work in Scotland.
Important question, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, you're finished. Can I just briefly ask you, before I bring in Graham, you said that there's expertise across the country, but not within specific local authorities, but that expertise is used to be shared. Is there is there a register that the local authorities can say, okay, I can get in touch with Glasgow City Council, they've got the expert on, as you say, sports stadiums, for example?
As far as I understand, that's being developed.
Right, okay, so it's in the process. Thank you. Graham?
Thanks, Convener. I just want to go back to the start, if I can, and just ask you a simple question. It's my understanding, and I think you've almost confirmed it, all of you, that currently Scottish regulations do not ban combustible materials on the facades of high-rise and high-risk buildings. That's my understanding. So if I'm right on that, can you give me your view on that? Do you think that they should be banned if they're not currently banned? So that's a simple question.
Sorry, after you.
I think we may all be about to agree on this one. Yeah, it comes back to the use of the BS 8414 test, meaning that if materials pass that, then they are still permitted on the outside of high-rise and high-risk buildings, currently over 11 metres in Scotland. And I think one of the things that the ABI would like to highlight is the importance of using these specific trigger heights. So, yes, that's a good measure, and we're supportive of that coming down to 11 metres, but currently the test still permits combustible materials on buildings that are over that. But it's also not just about having a trigger height. We don't believe that the risk of buildings should be assessed on trigger height alone. So if you look, say, for example, at the Bolton student block that caught fire on last week, that was of a trigger height of, I believe it's just over 17 metres, so that comes just under the English level of 18 metres. And it's actually really about looking at not just high-rise, but at high-risk and complex buildings as well. So it's about looking at the combustible materials that those buildings have on them, but also looking at the people that actually live and work in those buildings, especially the vulnerable people. So we're looking specifically at schools, at care homes, at hospitals, and some of those more vulnerable areas where the people within those buildings may struggle to evacuate as quickly as well.
I think you're all agreeing that they should be banned, so perhaps you don't need to all say yes.
Can I make a comment? May I make a comment?
I'm going to ask you about this test, but carry on.
No, I mean, I think the comment that I will make is, do we really understand exactly what are the implications of banning all combustible materials from the external components of buildings? Do we understand that buildings like this one will not exist?
And on that, please.
So if you look at this building from its outside, it's full of combustible materials. If you look at the double glazing, it will have combustible materials in between. If you look at many components that we have eliminated, by eliminating combustible materials. I really think that while it is impossible to say that the answer is not no, there should be no combustible materials, that is a very simple solution, but a solution that has become in many ways unacceptable to multiple other functionalities of buildings, and that right now prevail all over the country. So we have to be extremely careful when we make statements that are so simplistic when we're dealing with a problem that is so complex. This is not that simple of a problem to just say ban all combustible materials, because the implications are extraordinary. And while I do agree that I would like to see no combustible materials in any building to try to prevent all sorts of fires, we all recognize that it is unrealistic. We are surrounded by combustible materials, and we have to be a bit more intelligent in the way in which we look at this particular problem and not just simply make blank statements that effectively we're not going to be able to apply.
What do the rest of you think of that?
I think it's, what RSS would like to see is more harmonisation in terms of regulations between the United Kingdom. So in England, there's not the option to submit the BS 8414 test, therefore removing the possibility for other combustible materials. What they have is non-combustible or limited combustibility, so A2, S1, D0 materials. That, I think, is the way to go.
And we don't have that here?
Not yet.
Okay.
If I can make...
Dr. Goff.
Hello? Sorry.
Okay.
If I can make a point, the external envelope of the building is really a special consideration because rather uniquely it can communicate fire to all fire compartments of a building if it is combustible, and that leads to the challenges that we have. Now, the sort of the statistics that we have for death in fire within the UK are generally very good indeed, and across the world they are exemplary. In preventing fire spreading within a building, generally we are very good at that. But when it comes to the external envelope of the building, we have seen through countless fires now that can communicate fire to all occupancies very rapidly indeed. And so I don't think it is inappropriate to introduce what might seem as a draconian measure to sort out such a high consequence issue at this moment in time. But I do concur with Laura that the height trigger, when you consider all of the issues on the table at the moment, and as indicated by the recent fire in Bolton, that height is only one of the considerations, and really we would rather prefer to see the combustibility ban be based really about occupancy and function of the building to critical infrastructure and saving of life than just be based on height of multi-storey buildings.
Right. So you've all mentioned this BS 841 test. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that none of us here are experts. So perhaps in layman's terms, could you explain what that test is and what the issues are with it?
Maybe if you're happy for me to talk on this. The test is at a scale of a minimum scale of about 8 metres high and about 2 to 3 metres wide, and a large wood crib is placed in the bottom, and a completely pure facade is placed on the frontage, an L-shaped frontage of this simulated building. It has no penetrations in it, no windows, no vents, and no ducts. Then the idea is that the fire, it is to simulate once fire has broken out of a window of a building and is then lapping up the front of a building. And they look at the features of how the cladding on the front, how fire breaks into that and affects the cladding, the insulation. Because of the nature of these systems, there must be a void. And we know that voids, when it comes to voids, fire can be a problem because it can travel up. The major components that you have are the cladding surface, the often ACM, the insulation behind, the void in the middle, and the void is protected from fire spread through the void is protected by the provision of horizontal and vertical cavity barriers. These are devices which they are complex. They have quite a job to fulfill in that void must allow free-flowing air when there isn't a fire during normal use of the building. But they must close under the action of fire. So we use intumescent products on the front of that. So they will seal the 25 to 50 millimeter gap of the void when subjected to fire. So that is a very simple test. In purest form, I would say we would criticize it because sometimes I would criticize it as a test because of the scale of the testing, in that the fire is the same width as the test specimen, essentially. So you can seal that void totally. So I think I could see improvement there. But a lot of the criticism is really about how the test is used and how the results are used at the end of the day. It is perfect form. It doesn't feature things like vents, which can allow early entrance of fire into that all-important void area. And yet we see buildings going up with vents cut through the cladding system. So somebody has made an engineering judgment there. I'm not aware of any testing that's been done aside from the work we've done on whether that's an okay thing to do or not. But at the end of the day, also certain components often get missed out from this testing, such as the lighter membranes. These are fabric coverings of the insulation, typically, which we know can spread fire quite rapidly. And we've shown in our laboratory that it can spread fire faster than cavity barriers can respond. And we feel that if these were included in the testing, then the outcome might be changed. But the laboratories that do these testings report very accurately what has been done. I think when it comes to the previous conversation about competency, we need to ask ourselves whether people are doing the detail, reading those reports and saying, is that exactly what I've got on this building? Because if it isn't, then somebody, by accepting the system, somebody is making an engineering judgment, and quite a brave one at that, I would argue, to say things are okay based on that report.
Thank you very much.
To that as yeah, just to add sort of, I suppose the FPA research highlighted 5 key areas, which Jim has mentioned many of. The 2 he's not touched on quite so much is the fact that at the moment the fuel load, so the wooden crate that is essentially set on fire at the beginning is 100% wood, and we know that that's not realistic of a building today. Most buildings have at least 20% of plastic, which means that the fire tends to have higher flames and also has hotter flames. So some of the research that the FPA did identified that that was the case when you did the test with 20% plastic involved as well. And Jim's mentioned vents and ducts, the oxygen provision and the cavity barriers. That the 5th element that they looked at as well was the fact that what's determined the system detailing. So the way that the cladding is attached to the test rig is a lot more substantial than how cladding is actually, than we know how cladding is actually attached to buildings today. It's done with a lot more fixtures and fittings, and a lot more time is taken to attach it to the test rig than an actual building. So that's, again, some of the differences that we're seeing on the test rig compared to the real world scenario. But we're really pleased.
Just on that point, can I ask you then, see when the cladding is put up, is there any testing of how it is put up? I mean, is there a building manager or whoever that comes out, has a look at that and makes sure it's put up efficiently?
I don't know, Craig, if you're...
It depends. I mean, that's very much, it depends. I mean, it depends on the contractor, it depends on who's inspecting the site works. There's no one set system for inspecting cladding systems as it's installed.
Right. Okay, thank you.
May I comment briefly?
Yes, of course.
I think that I mean, you asked the question about BS 8414 and to describe the test. The test is a scenario test, so it attempts to create a scenario that is realistic in one way or another one. And you have heard numerous details that explain to some extent, why it might be somehow inappropriate of a test. And I think we all recognize that there are limitations to a scenario test. We are not building a building and burning the building, before we rebuild it again. We are creating a simplified scenario that is within reason to try to be able to reproduce the information that we need to get. Now we can, I can sit here and argue what are the variables that affect, for example, the flame height, and the flame temperature, and describe why a wood crib, which is what is inside the test, might not necessarily be representative of a modern environment. But at the same time, I can ask myself the question, does it have to be for me to get the information that I want? The question about these tests is about what is the information that you need from the test and how that information is then applied to the building site and to the real construction. And that's what requires an extremely competent professional. The limitation of all scenario tests, because of their natural complexity of trying to reproduce a complex problem like fire, is that they require an extremely competent individual to interpret the information. That is the limitation. It's not the test, it's not the details of the test or the problems of the test. A test cannot reproduce reality. It is about the need to have a proper interpretation of the test. And as you said, you're not experts in fire safety, and all the words that you're hearing, I'm sure they're getting through one ear and coming out as fast through the other, because these are technical details. You know, these are all technical details that are very, very difficult to understand and part of a professional field that requires a proper definition of competency. So it is not about the test, it's not about the details of why the test is not realistic or not. It is about who is interpreting the test and how is that being applied to the construction site.
I'm going to have to move on. Sorry, I'll come back to this because my colleague has to leave shortly, so I'm going to let him in to ask his questions just now, and we'll come back to this aspect of the discussion later.
Thanks very much, Convener. Yes, I want to focus on a practical problem that's arisen in the past 12 months or so, which is, I'm sure panellists will be familiar with, whereby following the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government Advice Note 14, there's been a knock-on effect to surveyors assessing the value of property and mortgage providers not being able to satisfy themselves that buildings are safe and owners not being able to do that either. And in the course of which mortgage providers are valuing buildings at zero, effectively meaning that people can't get mortgages, and this is locking up the housing market. I suppose my first question is, how can this be in Scotland, certainly for any building built post-2005 regulations?
So could you repeat that last part of your question?
I'm saying, why should this be required in Scotland, certainly for any building built post-2005 regulations?
Can I ask, have you seen the Cladding and Zero Valuation paper that we've submitted?
Yes, I have, yes.
Yes, that may answer some of the questions. That valuation is not my area of expertise. That question I may have to take back to the RICS and get you the kind of response that question requires. The Zero Valuation is a mechanism during the course of a mortgage valuation to prevent lending where further information is needed to make an assessment of value for lending purposes. So if the property in question does have a questionable cladding system that the valuer can't correctly identify, then that's when the zero valuation may come into play. Whether remediation works are needed requires specialist advice, as we really sort of touched on. And for that reason, a zero valuation will be reported until that further advice is received. And I know the mechanism is slightly different in Scotland. It's something we've identified in the paper that's been submitted. But further details on that, I'd like to take back to RICS and submit a detailed response.
So, given this problem exists at the moment, and I'm aware, indeed I'm convening a meeting this week, of valuers and surveyors and lawyers, there's a process underway to try and resolve this. I just want to focus on the practical issue here facing owners. Because if, and I think many of us have constituents who are struggling with this at the moment. I mean, if I own a flat in a high-rise development here in Edinburgh, down in the waterfront, for example, there's a number there. How am I to know, as the owner, I own that building, I own the external wall in Scots law, that is mine. How am I to know what that's made of? Therefore, how can I provide, and indeed how can a purchaser provide, any evidence sufficient to satisfy a mortgage lender that the building is safe?
An intrusive fire risk assessment.
No, okay, but where in the process should this come? I mean, I, as the seller of a property, should I not be in possession of all that requisite information in order to be able to pass it on to a seller, to a buyer? But why would a buyer or a seller have to undertake a fire investigation when they simply want to sell their house?
Unfortunately, if you look at it from the buyer's perspective, somebody wants to buy a house, you don't want to buy a house that is potentially covered in flammable material. Therefore, the only way to really go about this, if you don't have that information yourself as either the building manager or the property owner, is to conduct a fire risk assessment.
But should that not have been done at the time the building was constructed? should that information not be in the hands of the owners of the building, so that everybody that buys it in the future has got 100% knowledge about the material factors relating to the construction of the building they're selling?
In an ideal world, you're going to have the building design, and all that information is passed into the contractor, and that's passed on to the owner or the building operator. That unfortunately just doesn't happen. There's no system in place to manage that at present. It's one of the things that's come up in the post-Grenfell investigations, and that's been referred to as the golden thread, so that golden thread of information. In an ideal world, that's what will happen. Unfortunately, just now, it's just not happened. That's the situation we've got at the moment, and that's the reason why the cladding as evaluation thing is really a sticking point. So we've got to a situation where we've worked with UK finance and valuers to come up with a suggested proposal. It's not been pushed out into the public realm yet, but it is near to doing so, and we hope that that will ease the system in the meantime.
But my understanding is that none of this information is available, never mind fire safety. I mean, if I buy a flat in Edinburgh, I have no idea what works has been undertaken on that flat. I don't know when it was built, I don't know what the materials are, I don't know what common repairs have been done. There's virtually no information available to a consumer who's purchasing a massive product on the market, never mind the fire safety stuff. Does this have wider implications for how we buy and sell property to ensure that buyers and sellers are all fully informed about what they're owning and they're selling and what they're buying?
I think it does now. I mean, these fire issues have absolutely brought these things to light. Having detailed information about the building is sometimes the only way to proceed, and we would of course recommend having a full condition survey when it comes to buying or selling a property. But the problem is, at the moment, these things haven't happened. Even in new builds, people have faced these kind of problems. So we would absolutely recommend, number one, going with this proposed system at first, and for properties in question conducting a full intrusive fire risk assessment where necessary. Okay,
I understand the process is underway just now to try and provide a certification process. I mean, that raises all sorts of separate questions about if you have 200 people who own a flat in a property, or 100 people, whatever, who pays for it? Does that just fall on the people who randomly happen to be the people that are selling property today, as opposed to the people who don't intend to sell the property for another 5-10 years? Can I just move on to the insurance aspect of this? Because what mortgage providers are saying is that they are not satisfied that the building is, well, they're not satisfied as to the fire safety of the building. Whether the building is fire safe or not is not the issue. They're not satisfied, as they don't have any information about that, and therefore that affects the risk that they're taking on and lending against that property. Are these same considerations coming into play with respect to domestic building insurance?
So we are not aware that there are problems with the insurance market insuring buildings that may either require remediation or have ACM cladding on them at the moment. The insurance industry has not had a knee-jerk reaction to Grenfell Tower, I suppose, and for various reasons. Partly, often they'll insure a whole portfolio of buildings, so we'll take some of those high-risk properties with the low-risk properties. Insurers also have risk management teams that, if there are some high-risk properties, may go and actually walk around that property, not into individual dwellings, so they're not able to, but to understand a bit more about the building management, the fire safety measures that are installed. Does it have sprinklers? To look what sort of cladding they may have. And insurers since Grenfell have clearly taken a much bigger interest in fire safety and understanding fire risks of certain buildings. But similarly, an insurer isn't going to cut off, actually physically take off a piece of cladding and test it. That's where the sort of intrusive fire test comes along. So there are elements where an insurer will assume the worst if they don't know what type of cladding it is. Insurers have reported back that where they have had those conversations with building owners, they have actually been quite forthcoming, giving the information that they do have available. So that is great, and the fact that insurers are still insuring these buildings is also great. But as Jim mentioned earlier, there's this term estimated maximum loss, which is essentially an insurer's assessment of what is the biggest payout they're going to have to pay for, say, the building totally burns to the ground and they have to rebuild it. So prior to Grenfell, insurers may have taken into account the compartmentalisation of a building and assumed a lot more that the building regulations were going to work effectively. And therefore, if there was a fire in flat 3, there's an assessment that the insurer assumes that the compartmentalisation would work and that fire would be contained to flat 3. Now, what they're looking at is, OK, that might not work, so actually their estimated maximum loss is looking at the whole building, and therefore they're taking that into account. But there's not actually an insurance problem that we're aware of where buildings with ACM, high-pressure laminate, other cladding materials are not being insured, and that's because the insurers are going in, having those conversations with building owners and requesting that they have other fire risk measures, like having the 24-hour surveillance to ensure that that fire risk is reduced and that that building is still able to get insurance. Because what we don't want is there to be a knee-jerk reaction and the insurers say, we're not insuring any of this. You know, that's not ideal for anybody.
It's not ideal, no, but whether one characterises it as a knee-jerk reaction or not, that is what's happening in the mortgage market. There's virtually no mortgage providers available, willing to provide any mortgage product for certain types of buildings, which mean that families who are just about to emigrate to New Zealand are people who are going to buy, it's completely blocking up the market. Just a final question. I'm aware, Convener, that the time's pressing. In your helpful submission from the RICS, thanks very much for that, you give us a draft of this EWS 1 form, which, as I understand, is still under discussion and negotiation. Do you have an idea when this might be completed and when constituents of ours may then be able to start at least contemplating being able to buy or sell properties?
Mr. Whiteman, but I'll let you know as soon as I can.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just... Sorry, Annabelle, what you want?
Very briefly, I mean, I seem to recall I had actually been a minister at the time and sat on the Joint Ministerial Working Group in Building and Fire Safety, and of course the key first task, as I recall, was to identify high-rise buildings in Scotland where there may be cladding, and I'm sure RICS was involved in that to an point. And, therefore, a lot of work has been done. So, identify the developer, identify relevant local authority, seek to, where in doubt, go back to the applications and building standards and all the rest of it. A lot of that work has actually been done, Scotland-wide for high-rise buildings at least. So, I mean, begs the question as to, given that that work has been done and there is some kind of audit, what, can be usefully taken from that audit for slightly wider purposes? Mr. Ross, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the material. I've not actually seen that audit yet, and I understand from a meeting yesterday it's due to be published in some form next year. I think you have to be wary of what you publish in terms of detail. Publishing information on the precise building, location, name, etc., and if it's covered in combustible cladding, could present a higher risk. So I think the information will need to be vetted. I mean, MHCLG in England have a similar risk audit that's taken place, but they will not publish the details on that for that particular purpose. So that's point number one.
When you say there could be a higher risk, you mean in terms of saleability, marketability?
Yeah.
Arson? Okay.
Yeah. The second point, I mean, it depends what information they've collected. If they've collected to say, OK, this building has potentially combustible cladding on it, that's only one issue. It's only the cladding. The whole fire risk problem goes far deeper. Compartmentation, fire doors, self-closers, all of those things need to be taken into account, and that's what would be considered in a fire risk assessment. So I think they've maybe done the first part, identify the buildings. The second part is carry out your fire risk assessments.
I'm going to let Graham back in, but I've just got two comments to make and one question, and it follows on from Professor Torrero's discussion about skills basically being the important thing. Do people who, and the previous discussion about how the cladding and the testing is different from the cladding in reality, do cladders, if that's a name, but people who do the cladding, do they have specific requirements or skills to do this job?
No.
No? So it's just, right, okay. Which, given what we've seen, would suggest that that's not ideal then, right? Okay.
Our architects designing the systems don't have the skills. There's no requirement for them. Engineers that are implementing the systems are not required to have those skills, and nor are the individuals constructing the systems. So there's no real formal skills requirements. There's not even a skills definition.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's a very important point. And just to let the panel know and the witnesses know that we had asked UK Finance, it's based on the questions that have just been asked there just now, the previous Council of Mortgage Lenders, to attend today. We'd also asked the local authorities, Building Standards Scotland, to attend here today, which I think would have been quite important and useful, but neither of them could manage or said that they would be willing to attend. So just to put that on the record. And Graham, I'm going to let you get back in with your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just on that last point that you raised, Convener, so do you think, Professor Torero, that people should have a certain set of skills to put cladding up? I mean, should there be a system in place?
Fire safety is an incredibly complex process, and it requires a professional structure around it. And as such, everybody involved in the process should have a certain set of very well-defined skills.
Yeah.
And that could be corroborated and demonstrated.
Mr. Ross?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to build on that point by, I'll say, the competence steering group that was convened following Grenfell. Again, this is English focused, but competence in these areas, is very much a cross-border issue. The competence steering group formed 13 working groups that looked at these particular problems, so from designers to installers, and what level of competence should be required. That report's been produced, and the consultation period for that is now over. I would definitely suggest having a look at that, because that addresses very much the issue of competence and who should be competent when it comes to designing and installing things that have a fire risk.
And that steering group was established down south, right? So, and that report's available.
It is, yeah. It's called Raising the Bar, the Competence Steering Group report.
Okay, right. That's useful. It's certainly a concern that just anyone could put cladding up. Yeah, that is a worry. Can I ask? I'll just go back to something that Annabel Ewing was asking, but was about this audit of the building stock. My understanding is that that audit's not yet complete. Am I right?
I'm not too sure. We haven't actually been, as far as I know, involved in that. I believe that's been undertaken by Building Standards Scotland, as far as I'm aware. What they mentioned to me yesterday, they're calling it the high-rise inventory. It's in the process of being formed just now, and it will be published next year.
You don't know whether it's finished? No. And presumably it would also include, I mean, it's not just local authority stock, it would be private stock as well.
That's right, yep.
Right, so a lot of buildings. Okay, right. Can I ask, and we'll go back to this testing business. This committee has actually done quite a bit of work around on this area previously. In the previous session, we heard, worryingly, I think, that some cladding systems could make their way onto buildings through the use of desktop studies. Is that still the case? So in other words, they don't have to be tested in the lab or in any way. It could just be done on a computer.
They've been banned. Those assessments in lieu of tests are called the desktop studies. They've been banned in England. Professor Posey, have you?
But not in Scotland.
On them?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that needs to be defined is what is a desktop study. So, in principle, any decision regarding the use of cladding should be done by a professional analysis on the basis of evidence provided by the test. So the concept of a desktop study is an engineering analysis that allows to extrapolate the information of the test into an application. Now, the way in which I can use the desktop study, if the system that is being put in place is a system that it has sufficient similarities as deemed by a professional to something that has been tested where the evidence is there, then in principle it could be extended. Now, done by a competent professional or within a competent framework, that still remains an appropriate concept. When it's misinterpreted and is used without the evidence, or the extrapolation is done in a manner that is not necessarily responsible or competent, then of course it can create an enormous problem. Now, once again, the concept of banning a desktop study in itself is too simplistic of a concept. At the end, what you want is to be able to use the evidence that you have in an intelligent and responsible manner, and that should be verified in an appropriate way, for which calculations and analysis and desktop work is going to be necessary. So we have to be very careful, again, when we use this terminology, because a desktop study is a competent engineering professional assessment.
Okay, Dr. Glockling.
Thank you. Yes, the process for conducting a desktop study has been improved quite greatly with the introduction of BS 9414, which is a standard for extended application of data. So rather than just allowing anyone to take the results of one test and see if it may be applied, see if it is appropriate grounds to make changes, BS 9414, the extended application methodology, introduces a technique whereby you can infer performance between the limits of two tests. So if you undertake an 8414 test with a certain thickness of insulation, it's 100 mm of insulation, and then you conduct an 8414 test with 300 millimeters of insulation, and they both pass, then the 9414 methodology suggests that as long as the extremities passes at both ends, then you can infer that to use insulation thicknesses between those might be appropriate. But what it doesn't allow you to do is to infer that the use of insulation thicknesses lower than or higher than those within the tested limits are appropriate. And this must be viewed as a great improvement, because at least you're bounding your areas of knowledge to make sure that everything still remains linked into a test.
Thank you.
Can I follow on from that? Obviously, this whole idea of desktop, you've indicated the potential that has. Now, the standard, the guidelines, the competency of all of that needs to be looked at as to how that can effectively, because organisations, individuals have used that potential desktop scenario to decide what is appropriate in some circumstances. But would you agree that that is appropriate, or that could have implications if it hasn't been carried out effectively?
I think I think what 9414 does is at least ensure that those conducting the desktop studies are confined to between two known points of pass, rather than actually working from a single point on a graph, essentially, and inferring or applying engineering judgment to say outside of those limits, anything else is okay. So it certainly is an improvement. And if we think about what has happened historically, what is probably little known to people is pre-Grenfell just how few 8414 tests have actually been conducted. It's very, very few in number indeed. So the majority of systems that are on buildings have been justified on the grounds of desktop study. And this is what needs to be moved away from.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. What we're saying is that going back to the idea that the concept of a desktop study is actually the correct process. Yes. So even when you look at BS 8414, and if you look at my Phase 1 Grenfell report, you will see that the only means for approval is basically taking evidence from the test that then you are going to use to make a decision. So you need that process. So the desktop study in itself is appropriate. Now, the standard that is being described by Dr. Golik it is a mechanism by which we're trying to reduce the level of competency necessary by bounding what somebody can do or cannot do. So by forcing people to interpolate instead of extrapolate, you're basically reducing the necessary level of competency. But even that standard has no definition of what is the competency of the user. Yeah. So in principle, I can even interpolate very wrongly. Yes. You know, and I still need to have an accompanying definition of competency. And obviously, the simpler the process is, the consistent level of competency is lower. But when we're talking about cladding, we're talking about an incredibly complex system by definition, so the level of competency needs to be defined appropriately.
Okay.
So it's far too easy for things to slip through. I mean, it's all very well saying that a desktop study is okay in theory, but if the expertise isn't out there, then surely things are getting through that shouldn't be getting through. And Dr. Gloughlin's nodding.
Yes. And I think in this case, obviously from insurance perspective, we strive for resilience. And when we look for resilience, generally we look for lowering the requirement on human intervention and interactions here, and lowering complexity, increasing simplicity, increasing safety factors. Now, all of these things get taken care of when you consider the banning of combustible materials. We end up with a building which is less susceptible and susceptible to deviation in use and change of use. It's less susceptible to deviation of poor design, poor installation, poor construction. So all these things to do with whether the UK builders can deliver CAD level accuracy in what the building that's actually put up. Many of these problems disappear just because you have a building which is much less susceptible to deviation in use and design and construction. And this is why we do favour the ban so highly.
Unfortunately, that is not a correct statement, because if you really think about the integrity of the fire safety strategy, you will realize that eliminating combustible materials is true, is going to reduce the problem significantly. But nevertheless, it still allows the door for many other forms of failure. So the moment that you have a lightweight facade attached to a heavyweight construction, you're going to have massive relative deformation. So if you're going to rely, for example, on stay-put strategies, where effectively you cannot have breaching, then even with no combustible materials, building envelopes are very susceptible to allow fires to progress from one floor to another one. So in a way, the problem is that when we make a decision that is too simplistic, we create a false sense of safety because we stop thinking. And we result in a situation where effectively we feel very comfortable and very confident that we are achieving an appropriate solution, but the inconsistency between the components of a strategy is still there. You know, I rather see people thinking in a very serious and intelligent way with very clear bounds of competency than actually putting straight bans that effectively stop us from thinking. If you want to get brain surgery, you're going to go to a highly qualified neurosurgeon because you know that this is an incredibly complex problem. Fire safety is an incredibly complex problem, as you can see from all these descriptions. Therefore, it requires an equal level of competency. And we cannot ignore that by putting all sorts of other measures trying to cover the fact that we don't have skills that enable us to design buildings of this level of complexity.
Can I just come in on that? I totally agree. I mean, right now we're focusing on the ban, on the cladding issue. There are, you need to take a holistic view of the whole fire, of a whole building system and the other fire measures that are in that as well. And I totally agree with the Professor's view on the importance of confidence. I just want to clarify as well what we're saying with the BS 8414 test and the assessment in lieu of a test, so the desktop ban, is that it is the best test that is out there at the moment, but the FPA have found some fundamental flaws, which mean that the level of competency to interpret what that test provides is actually, you need to be of an incredibly high level of competence to do that. So what we're actually saying is ban the test for the time being and the desktop studies as they have done in England. The British Standard Institute is now reviewing and assessing how they can make improvements to that test. Right. So until those improvements have been considered and the test improved to incorporate and ensure that as good as only a test can be, it will be as good as it can be on establishing the real world scenarios that we do see, knowing that it is just a test, it's not a whole system. But until that has been improved, we do not think that we should be building buildings, knowing what we do today, that have combustible materials on the outside of them, when we're very unsure about how that may all work.
And ask, if the test is banned and desktop is banned for a particular period of time, are you suggesting then that no houses above a certain height are be built during that period?
So we don't believe that combustible materials on the outside of those buildings should be being built. I mean, on all buildings, I think what you need to look at is buildings over 11 metres and high risk and complex buildings to start off with. It would be great to say, no, don't build any buildings at all with any combustible materials on, but as Professor's pointed out, you know, that's highly unrealistic. So let's start somewhere, and knowing what we know about high-rise buildings and high-risk buildings, let's make sure that we're not putting combustible material on those buildings, especially when those buildings may house vulnerable people within them.
Okay. Sarah wanted to come in then, Annabelle, and then back to you.
I suppose what this is making me think, we've rightly focused on new build at the moment in terms of what should be happening now and in the future. It's leaving a huge question in my head about existing buildings and about fire safety and about all the things that people can do as owners, as renters, as managers of buildings to make buildings as fire safe as possible. So there are things like safety doors, there are exit issues, advice issues to people. There's also just what are the risks of creating fires in buildings. You know, if you're in a professional building, all your equipment, all your electrical equipment is tested on a regular basis. None of us do that in the house. What are the points that we as owners or renters, the point when you arrive and leave in a house, are there opportunities there to make people aware of the fire safety worthiness of their house, what they can do to sustain or improve that? I mean, one of the questions I didn't get around to earlier was about the installation of automatic fire suppression systems in more types of homes. Should that happen? Should we wait till 2021? There's a whole agenda about existing homes. And we've rightly focused on new build, but there's something about what's happening meantime in terms of our own knowledge.
I'd like
as
to
citizens.
answer that one if I can. I mean, you're right. I mean, we're talking about new builds, which will be a very small percentage of buildings year on year. So that, you know, the elephant in the room is the existing housing stock, without a doubt. Two ways to tackle that. Number one, you know, what we've spoken about is identifying where the risks are and having a proper fire risk assessment. The second is in educating people in terms of fire safety. So as we moved through the post-Grenfell process in England, we realised there was a bit of a gap when it came to, you know, what we call consumer advice. So we produced, and there's this document here, the Clear and Partial Guide to Fire Safety, and that was very much aimed, rather than being building professionals and surveyors, to be aimed at members of the public. And it's simple advice in terms of fire safety because, you know, we're focusing very much on cladding here. As I mentioned earlier on, the main issue starts with occupation, you know, whether it's somebody cooking or whether it's somebody smoking or a candle or whatever. Those basic things should definitely be addressed as well, and that's what we hope to do with this particular document. The meeting we had with Scottish Fire and Rescue Services yesterday, we're looking at augmenting this and making it applicable to Scotland too. So that's, you know, this second point is definitely educating homeowners on what they should be doing. I think that's a big step to take.
May I add a very brief point there? I think that I'm all in favour of educating the public, and I think the more the public is educated, probably the more you're going to reduce the potential hazards, in particular within the home, where we tend to see the majority of the problems. The only thing that we have to be extremely careful is on the presumption of competency. Our building regulations, the way in which we design buildings, assumes or presumes no competency on the user. And that has to remain. And so if we ever think of educating the consumer to try to supplement what we are providing through building regulations and through the design process, that it would be a terrible mistake, because we are really changing completely the paradigm by which we operate.
Alexander, you wanted to come in?
Yep. I mean, following on from Sarah Boyack's comments, the whole idea about where we are at the moment has been fascinating to see what you believe the industry and the trade and the organisation should be dealing with. But the Scottish Government itself has put in place some actions for the future as to where things should happen and what they believe. And we've talked about the review that's ongoing. You've discussed some aspects of the audit that will come out next year. But the Scottish Government have already put in place the idea that from February 2021, there will be new legislation and there will be new priorities that should be based. And some of these are obviously very positive, where they talk about having a smoke detector installed in the general room, i.e. the lounge, or they will have the space within a staircase or a landing would have some sort of detector. And Ms Boyks talked about the doors and all of that fall into that. And also that there would be an alarm installed within every kitchen. Now, these are very positive and that gives hope for the future that there will be some safety, security, you've talked about that going forward. But there is the element that we've talked about when we've said that when it comes to owner-occupiers, there's not going to be any real enforcement regulation with reference to that. So some are saying already, well, what's the point of having all of those specific if there's not to be some enforcement, because that's good to have an aspiration, or it's good to have, it's very laudable that you're considering all of that, but in reality it's not going to solve the problem. It may only create more problems in locations that don't have all of that being enforced, that individuals will then be put at risk, and the safety and the security will once again become a problem. So can I ask you what your views are on that, as to how that is being addressed? Or do you once again feel, as some believe, that it's pointless in some respects to have all that aspiration when it's not actually going to fulfil something?
I mean, I think that clearly the moment that you're talking about putting extra measures of safety, you're talking about smoke detectors, you're talking about potentially sprinklers, you're talking about all sorts of other elements. Clearly, all these things have in nature a positive effect. Now, obviously, if they don't come accompanied by a mechanism of enforcement, then effectively what they create is a false sense of safety. Furthermore, all these things are components of an integral fire safety strategy that by themselves, they don't offer the safety that they apparently seem to provide. So they have to be part of an integral fire safety strategy that is determined, by the level of competency of those designing, of those approving, and of those enforcing. So if you don't put the provisions and the investment in education and training, and in establishing the requirement of skills of all the people involved, then effectively you're creating, again, another false level of safety. And the worst part of the whole thing is that when you're talking about all these new technologies, the addition of any new technology for the purpose of protection increases the level of complexity of the infrastructure. And the moment you increase the level of complexity, the functionalities and the interaction between them are very complex. So your level of skill, once again, goes up. So it might end up being actually a counterproductive effect. So you have to be extremely careful that there has to be an enormous consistency in the approach that covers all the components so that you get an integrated approach to safety.
Okay.
Yes, if I could just make a point. If I could just make a point on detection, I think really any changes to detection, if they're going to be made, could they at least, we would request that could they at least be classed as high integrity detectors so they are at least believable. Our belief is the day of the normal smoke detector, well, it's had its day. These trigger on many events which are either not fire events or certainly not events which you would want to launch a fire engine for. Yet we've done a large study on this which has shown that on a cost-neutral basis, high integrity detectors, which look for more than one fingerprint of fire and are likely to be 80% honestly reporting a need for a turnout from the fire service, are available now, and there are no technological challenges to doing this. So we've done a lot of work on this and have lobbied hard for it. It would just appear a relatively simple change to make to at least ensure that detectors are believable. It was quoted from the Bolton fire this weekend that no one thought to leave their rooms because false alarms were a weekly event. So what purposes are they actually serving?
Exactly.
In owner-occupier, I'd like to make one more point. And they do have some very key responsibilities for ensuring the preservation of the fire safety management plan of the building. So in the UK, in England and Wales, where you have a light timber frame construction, where the fire compartmentation is only one layer of plasterboard thick. Anyone putting up shelves, installing new sockets, or actually countersinking their TV into this layer can have a drastic impact on the safety and well-being of the others within that building. I sought clarification from this from the then DCLG as to whether the Party Wall Act would come into play, because ultimately you are making a change that could alter the structural integrity of the building for your neighbours. Now, I think in Scotland, this is handled under common law, which I'm not familiar with. But when I set different scenarios of would you need to inform your neighbours when putting up shelves or inserting recessed lighting, installing new wall sockets or countersinking a telly into a party wall, I was asked, was it materially relevant? And the response was slightly unhelpfully that yes, it would be relevant if it turns out to have been required post-fire. But also, they did helpfully say that the neighbours that would need notifying would be anyone sharing a party wall with you, be it horizontally or vertically. And I think this is something which there is a great lack of awareness about, of responsibility for owner-occupiers at the end of the day, and the products they might need to preserve the fire boundary are not the sort of products that you buy off the shelf in B&Q. They need something very different. So there does need to be an awareness of the structure that they inhabit and the extra onus placed on them, particularly where it's a building of combustible structure or insulation, so that they know what their duties are. But I'm not aware of any provision for that currently.
That is a perfect example of the presumption of competency.
Yes.
So are we designing systems that are so fragile and like so much robustness that they require for the user to have a PhD in fire safety engineering?
Exactly.
I mean, this is a problem. Where is the presumption of competency? Yeah. Is it on the designer, the builder, or on the user? This is one of those perfect examples where I believe that the problem is too complex to pretend that this is going to be a problem or responsibility of the user.
And you've identified that exactly in the case that the competency level that's required in this situation exacerbates the problem potentially going forward. And what you've already said today has just given more fuel to that process to indicate that we are creating a society that we are protecting or attempting to protect, and we're giving that sense of security, but that may be a false sense of security that we're actually implementing, and how it's being interpreted by the government and other agencies into how that works. So you make some very valid points about where we should be going and what we should be trying to achieve, but in the short to medium term, where do you think we should actually be trying to do, or what should we be trying to do to secure some of that?
Well, I mean, I think when we say the short and medium term, I think there is an element that is absolutely necessary to insist, is that the definition of competency cannot be postponed. No. Because if not, we're going to be creating a worse and a worse problem to fix. And if we come 10 years from now, we're going to have much, much bigger of a problem. So we need to make that decision in the short term. Now, the problem is that how do we compensate through the period in which we're building up that competency? I think that clearly it is necessary to take a step back. And that step back to design systems that are simpler and to design systems that are more robust. Now, you can call that a ban, yes, but what I would suggest is a very intelligent approach towards that. So effectively bring people that really understand this to try to inform carefully, how we implement a step back so that we have simpler and more robust systems, as opposed to just simply set up a blanket ban that could potentially lead to a false sense of safety.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Annabelle.
Convener, picking up on a few points, really, now we're just coming to close of this evidence session. On the issue that Mr Stewart raised about the legislation on the installation of interlinked smoke alarm and heat alarm in the kitchen, I mean, I support that. I absolutely support that. And I take on board that Dr Glauckling's point that, in and of itself, and the Professor's point about human behaviour and all the rest of it, and competency in and of itself, this is not a magic protection, but I think it is an element of protection that it would be better to have than not to have. I think that's important. I think it's also the case that you have to have this in rented property anyway at the moment. So I think that speaks volumes about, you know, why it is a regulation that is currently in place. As far as the enforcement issue is concerned, I think that might be a bit of a red herring, because I would imagine that when this becomes comes into force for domestic properties, the attitude of insurance companies may well be similar to the way that insurance companies would have previously reacted to window locks, the kind of lock you have on your front door, etc. I would imagine that a question that will be asked once this legislation is in place for domestic dwelling houses is if you have this, okay? And if it isn't a question, I would be surprised, because those are the types of questions that the insurance industry tends to focus on when there is legislation or guidance in place. And indeed, I would have thought, therefore, that would impact on the level of premium being quoted by the insurance company. Turning to a very important point that was raised about the stay put principle, I think it is really important to say that here in Scotland, as far as the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service is concerned, they have a presumption of stay put, but it is not an immutable presumption. It is based then on the decision of the commander, if you like, in charge in that fire. And it is not, you know, to be adhered to through thick and thin. It is based on the decision of the commander at the fire, at the incident. Now, also in that regard, it's important to stress that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service acquaint themselves regularly with the building layout and all the rest of it of high-rise buildings in every single part of Scotland. They had done that before Grenfell. Immediately post Grenfell, they did a power of work in also trying to speak to every resident in that building, or at least communicate with them in writing, and they still continue to carry out that practice, which is very important, because they know then the building layout, they know what the issues may be, they know also in terms of access of fire engines to the building. That is something that they do, so this again has to be looked at in the round of activity that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service carry out in terms of the important issue of competency that the Professor raised. But I don't think we can simply ignore all that good work that the SFRS carry out. And of course, I think it's important also to stress for anybody that's watching this convener that the SFRS offer home fire safety visits to anybody anywhere in Scotland, just if anybody's watching this and are a bit concerned about what they've heard. So I just wanted to make those points because I think it is important that we deal with the factual situation here in Scotland on the ground. Thank you.
I can add a couple of brief comments. I think that I completely concur with you that if there is one element of fire safety that we have unequivocal evidence that it has had an enormous positive impact in saving lives of people are smoke detectors. Now, clearly, we deal with the issue of nuisance, and the issue of nuisance alarms is a problem and has to be handled appropriately, and there are means to deal with that. And it is clear that of all the potential measurements that we can put in place, you know, that is one that effectively has an unequivocal track record of having saved lives. So I completely concur with that. And as I said, the other issues can be dealt with. And we have technologies and we have information that allows us to handle this in the most appropriate of ways. Now, when it comes to the fire service dealing with a situation where stay put doesn't work, I think it is clearly, you know, people have done many things to try to improve the way in which we handle that type of situation. But I believe that the Phase 1 report of Sir Martin Morbig makes it painfully clear how difficult is the decision-making when there is a need to make the decision of moving away from stay put. And we have to be conscious of that, because it is a really, really important aspect of the fire safety strategy to maintain compartmentalization. And when that breaks down, the sequence of decision-making is so complex in nature that we have to be very conscious that that is the case.
Okay, thank you.
On the insurance element that you mentioned. So insurers are going to assume that legislation is being fulfilled. They're not going to ask that each and every customer whether they are compliant with all legislation that is in place. So if there is a legislative requirement for alarms, then there will be an assumption by insurers that those are in place. They're not in the habit of asking questions around every sort of every alarm being there and every piece of legislation being appropriate, as they do, you know, or in the past have assumed that building regulations will be, you know, met. Kind of, I suppose, more questionable now. But they are in the habit of looking at fire risk management systems, measures that are in place, and taking that into account when they're looking at offering premiums. So insurers offer cover on what they term as a risk-based pricing. So if it's high fire risk, there may be a higher cost premium associated with that cover because of this, as we were previously talking about, estimated maximum loss. So whatever measures a building owner or others put into those buildings, the insurer will be able to take that into account. And be that alarms, be that sprinklers where sprinklers are appropriate, other fire risk measures will all be taken into account in a sort of holistic approach to fire risk management. I would very much like to echo Dr. Glockling's point about the high integrity fire alarms. These kind of seem a bit of a no-brainer, especially in areas like student accommodation where they're going off every day because students are doing silly things. And not only is this going to mean that the number of false alarms are reduced, and these high integrity fire alarms essentially not just look at smoke, but they look at the need of smoke and heat and various other elements as well. The FPA's got a report that we can share with you on that. So they're going to reduce false alarms. They're going to mean that when an alarm is going off, people in those buildings are actually realising there is a fire and will do whatever the requirements of them are to do, whether it's stay put or get out. But it's also going to reduce the number of false alarms that the Fire and Rescue Service have too. With such a tight resources at the moment, you know, it's about managing that as well. And these are to us, quite an obvious solution that are available at the moment to look at reducing those fire alarms that are false and really being able to target all resources to the ones that actually are occurring.
So you say that there's an assumption that the householder, the policyholder would comply with applicable legislation. And therefore, I presume the consequence of that is if the legislation is not complied with and these integrated systems are not installed, that would be a breach of the policy and would vitiate the cover. And therein lies your enforcement right there.
So insurers are not enforcers of legislation. They can indeed encourage better practice. It's up to an individual insurer how they would approach if there was a fire in a home where they didn't have those measures. That's a sort of a commercial decision for an individual insurer to decide. I would imagine that they could potentially choose to not pay that claim if it's not required, but you know, if they're not requiring or fitting with legislation, but that's very much a commercial decision for insurers to make. Some may choose to do it, others may choose to pay out, and that's something that individual insurers will decide.
Also, and we've kind of touched on this there just now, but are there any other additional fire safety related interventions you would like to see Scottish Government consider? If so, what are they and why do you think they'd be particularly important?
I've highlighted the importance from the insurance industry to assess not just on trigger height but high risk properties and the vulnerability of those within those properties as well. And I think our clear ask is about the current BS 8414 not being appropriate at the moment. So we'd call for not using that until it's been reviewed and reformed.
Okay, thank you. I mean, anything that has been mentioned so far? Dr. Glocklin.
A couple of things on our account. Whilst we're talking about predominantly about fires spreading up outside the buildings when the fire source has been from within the building, we are seeing an increased susceptibility of buildings ending up on the floor as a result of external fire sources. Now, currently, fire ingress from the outside doesn't really play a part in building regulations. And we feel with the change of our construction methods, they are becoming a great deal more susceptible. And often this is due to very simple and easily controlled design features, such as things like plastic air bricks. We've had a great number of fires where fire has come in directly through sometimes accidental means, discarded cigarette into leaf litter, which then goes against one of these and then takes down a building. You'd be surprised how many have come down that route. Accidental, people in an alleyway posting cigarette ends into these devices. And then there have been potentially some more mischievous ones as well, where it is seen as a light blue touch paper for bringing down buildings. These are generally a problem for buildings of combustible structure, such as and void, such as light timber frame. So I think fire ingress is an emerging issue that certainly we need to be cognizant of, and perhaps afford buildings greater protection around. So I think that was one. And then also to have a general theme when considering regulations that the world is imperfect. And actually, what gets drawn with CAD accuracy might not be what gets built. In fact, I'd almost say it's always not what is built. And so therefore, if we adopt that approach, how resilient does a building become? How susceptible is it to this deviation? And that is an area which, when we talk about, we do a lot of work for the military and protection of things like warships, critical infrastructure. This is core to everything we do, except that the world is imperfect, except that some of the systems which you put in place are going to fail. How does it still stack up? How many systems can fail? How much deviation can be tolerated before everything breaks down? But our building regulations, as I mentioned before, don't have a concept of safety factor or resilience. And I think now is the time, particularly with the sensitivity of some of the building methods we see, to really have a long, hard look at this and maybe consider it as a separate item.
Okay, thank you very much. Do either of the...
I'd just like to, we've been a little focused on cladding here. Cladding's a very important issue, but there's definitely more to fire risk than cladding. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service yesterday really hammered home the compartmentation issue that Professor Jose has touched on. That's equally important in terms of fire risk. Bolstering for new builds the clerk of works role is certainly something we'd like to see. Is that role being reintroduced, and however the Scottish Government can assist with that. Harmonisation between regulations, so whether it's across the UK or indeed internationally, the International Fire Safety Standards Committee are really looking at a baseline of fire safety. Fire doesn't respect borders. What can we learn from other countries, and what good practices can we adopt here? I'd definitely like to see more of that. And finally, education of the homeowner and the consumer when it comes to basic fire safety is really going to help to stem that problem before it starts.
Okay, thank you. Any final ones?
I just want to reiterate the point that I've been making from the beginning, that I think that there should be an introspection on how much the Scottish Government has invested in education and training in the area of fire safety, and look ahead in a manner such that this becomes a systematic, and continuous investment to try to maintain, a high level of education, professional education and training. And it is important to note that that Scotland is the world leader in the area of fire safety engineering, and world leader in the area of fire service training. You have institutions like Glasgow Caledonian and the University of Edinburgh that are leading the world in this space, and I think they are a resource that should be capitalized in a systematic way to try to maintain the level of competency in the country.
Okay, thank you very much. And on that positive note, I want to thank the panel for attending today's session, and to you, Dr. Glockling, for appearing by video link. I hope that was okay for you. I now move...
It worked very well.
Thank you. I now move this meeting into private, as agreed earlier in the meeting. Thank you very much.